Another Christmas is upon us, guys. Boy, time flies by really quick these days. And as every December, it's time for another series of Thomascember for 2022. And since last year's Thomascember, where I reviewed series 1 episode by episode, went down really well and got a lot of views and comments, I figured, why not carry it on this year with series 2? So throughout December this year, you're going to see a review for all 26 episodes of the second series of the TV series. Everything you need to know about the episodes, plot-wise, new characters, trivial facts, and all that jazz. And I know a lot of you are going to be wondering, why aren't I reviewing series 24 and the final direct-to-DVD specials that they've done for Big Adventures? Well, I just think it just makes sense to carry on reviewing the classic series episode by episode for the time being. And it is quite possible you're going to see those reviews for the later seasons very, very soonish, after a couple of years maybe. But one thing is definitely certain, I am steering clear of All Engines Go. That piece of shit can rot in hell for all I care. But all that aside, for the next 26 days throughout the month of December, you're going to be seeing Series 2 reviews episode by episode, just like last year when I did Series 1 episode by episode. There's 26 more episodes to get through this year, and I'm not going to disappoint you with my reviews and thoughts and Trivial Pursuit facts. All aboard for Thomascember 2022. Before I talk about the first episode of this series, I'm going to go through a little bit of Trivial Pursuit about the production of Series 2. Due to the popularity of the first series of the show, Britt Allcroft and David Mitton wasted no time in starting production for the second series of the show. The majority of the episodes were based on stories written by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry, and his son Christopher Awdry was commissioned to write a new Railway series book as source material for the second series, and that book being More About Thomas the Tank Engine. Not the most imaginative title for the Railway series, but whatever. Britt and David decided to go with this choice because they wanted more episodes to be centred around Thomas the Tank Engine, but they were still under contract to use stories based on the Railway series. Whatever story they were making for the episodes, they had to be based on a story written by an Awdry. But the only problem was, because they wanted to make Thomas the Tank Engine the main character of the series, there weren't a lot of stories left from the Railway series where Thomas was the main character. So in a nutshell, they went up to Christopher Awdry and said, "Hey, can you write a couple of stories about Thomas the Tank Engine so we can use it for series 2? No, please, no, please, no, please, no, please, no, please, no, pretty please with sugar lumps on top." Okay, sure. And the rest is history. In the series finale, Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree was a one-off story written by Christopher Awdry. So every single episode for this series was written by an Awdry, Wilbert and Christopher. Everyone knows about the cancelled Missing Coach episode since a lot of photographs from the episode were leaked online a few years ago, and leaks still continue to surface on the internet to this day. But it was also originally planned for Percy's Promise, Gordon Goes Foreign and Doubleheader to be considered for episodes for the series, but were dropped and replaced with Christopher Awdry's new stories. According to sources, Gordon Goes Foreign in particular was not filmed because its production costs budget was too high, and we all know The Missing Coach was close to finishing production when Britt Allcroft decided to cut the episode due to the story lacking action and it being too confusing for young viewers to follow. And we wouldn't get Percy's Promise and Doubleheader until series 3 of the show in the 90s, with Doubleheader being renamed to Time for Trouble. And after all these behind the scenes factors, the second series premiered on the 24th of September 1986 in the UK, with Sir Ringo Starr returning to narrate all episodes for the series. Another interesting fact for you guys, I actually got to see the first 8 episodes of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends Series 2 when my grandparents had it recorded for me. It was on a VHS tape they had, which had a VHS collection of the Magic Roundabout episodes, as well as the first 8 episodes of Thomas Series 2, because they knew how much I loved Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, and they introduced me to the Magic Roundabout at the same time. Not exactly essential to the history of Series 2, but I thought it'd be interesting for you guys to hear how I got introduced to this series in the first place. On a VHS tape which also included the Magic Roundabout, 2 of my childhood favourites. And with all that out of the way, let's dive into the first episode of the series, Thomas, Percy and the Coal, based on the story of the same name for the Railway series book, More About Thomas the Tank Engine. Again, not the most creative title for a Railway series book. One beautiful morning on Sodor, Thomas is puffing happily along his branch line with Annie and Cloudbell when he arrives at Elsbridge Station. After Percy compliments Thomas on his paintwork, he brags to Percy and Toby about having the best paintwork on Sodor. When they tell him that they like their own colours, Thomas says that blue is the only colour for a really useful engine and puffs away. Later that day, Thomas is resting by the coal hopper when Percy arrives to fill up some coal trucks. Thomas warns Percy of the trucks' antics and a set of unsafe buffers on the siding behind him. The trucks push Percy into the siding, causing a large pile of coal to fall on Thomas and cover his paintwork in coal dust. Percy is worried, but cannot help laughing as Thomas's blue paint is ruined. Thomas is furious and blames the incident on Percy. It takes so long to clean Thomas that Toby has to take Annie and Cloudbell instead. Both coaches feel sorry for him, of course. That night in the sheds, Thomas was grumpy with Percy. While Toby thinks it's quite funny, Percy is cross at Thomas for thinking he ruined his paintwork on purpose, and the two engines argue for the rest of the night. The next day, when Percy brings some trucks from the junction, he's feeling very thirsty. So he goes to the siding where the water tower is. However, the siding has unsafe buffers, and as Percy rolls into the siding, he finds that he can't stop, crashes through the buffers and lands in a pile of coal. Thomas has seen everything and laughs as he leaves while Percy lies in the coal, filthy and humiliated. That night, after Percy is cleaned up, he and Thomas apologise to each other for what happened and promise to be more careful with coal next time. This episode was the start of Thomas and Percy's friendship in the TV series, something that Britt Allcroft and David Mitton and the people that followed on from their leadership afterwards wanted to focus on a lot in the TV series after this. A lot of times when you see the two in the TV series after this episode, they're usually in an episode together, or at least make a cameo together. And it was very rare that we'd see these two apart from each other. And it just became an ongoing trend for the series. And this episode was also the first time we got a glimpse of Thomas's boastful and cheeky personality. I mean, obviously we had seen his cheekiness before in the first series, but this series takes it to a new level where he's more boastful than anything else, and starts to think very highly of himself. As the Unlucky Tug pronounced it, this was the series when Thomas started to show off his prattish side. And you could definitely tell from this episode how pratty he's being when he has his coal bunker accident. And speaking of which, was the workman operating that coal hopper really stupid enough to not stop it when they realised there were no trucks there? Or was he just doing something and just didn't notice at the time until it was too late? I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it. It's also the first time Thomas and Percy have a huge falling out with each other. And it should be worth pointing out that in the book, the argument goes on until the final story of the book, Drip Tank, which for some reason was not adapted for the series. My guess is Britt Allcroft and David Mitton didn't want the argument to go on throughout the whole series. And you can also see the start of another trend throughout the whole of Series 2, where we see the Highland of Sodor's more industrial side, what with the coal hopper, the yards and all that jazz. First series made it more like a book world, where everything came out the pages of a book. But here we see the industrial side of Sodor, which is what a lot of railway lovers would love to see. Because a lot of people associate railways as being industrial. And this was the first series to show the more industrial side of the island, making it more than just a happy-go-lucky book world. That was just one of the many big step-ups from the previous series. And you remember in the last series where Ringo Starr sounded quite calm, like a grandfather telling these stories to his kids at bedtime? Well, in this series he ups it up a notch, giving a lot more oomph in his performance, especially when he's required to sound shocked or angry or scared.
Well, anyway, Thomas, blue is the only colour for a really useful engine. Everyone knows that.
He just really ups it this year. And Michael Donnell and Junior Campbell returning for the composers really upped their game for the music here. Of course they reused some of the old classic themes from the first series, as you would expect the great composers to do, but they of course composed some new tracks for this series, like the ever so famous Danger theme. Obviously we only hear a small snippet of it in this episode, but it really does sell the tension for the danger scenes throughout the series. I especially love how it starts when Ringo Starr's announced in the water column with the unsafe buffers in the siding.
The water column stood at the end of the siding with the unsafe buffers.
Even though nothing exciting has actually happened quite yet, The music that Mike and Junior make for that particular scene makes it clear that something bad's going to happen. That's just some great foreshadowing on Mike and Junior's behalf. In my opinion, Thomas, Percy and Nicole was a really good way to start off Series 2. It shows us familiar characters, shows us more of Thomas's branch line, shows the industrial side of Sodor, and it starts the trend of Thomas and Percy's friendship. If you haven't seen this episode for a while, I highly recommend checking it out. It's a fun watch and you'll get to see the first few industrial parts of the island of Sodor. And this would only be the start of what Series 2 had to offer. Cows, the second episode of the second series of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, is based on the story of the same name by the Railway series book, Edward the Blue Engine. This was the first story in the second series to be based on a Wilbert Awdry story. And does it hold up today as it did back then? Let's take a look. Edward's age is beginning to show due to having some worn out parts, causing him to make clanking noises. One day, Edward is pulling some cattle wagons to a nearby market town. The trucks are making a lot of noise, as is he by this point. Near the line is a field where some cows are grazing, and they become provoked by the noise from the train as they are not used to them. As Edward passes by the fence, a number of cows break loose, charge across the line and break a coupling, causing the last truck and the guards van to be left behind. But even the jerk to just be the trucks misbehaving, Edward continues on his journey. It was not until Edward arrives at the next station when he and his driver realised what happened. Gordon and Henry hear about the incident and find it very funny, leading them to tease Edward about letting a few cows break his train and brag that they could handle cows easily, to his annoyance. Toby is also ignorant towards the larger engines, as he knows they have never encountered cows like he has and do not understand the trouble they cause. A few days later, Edward's mood is still bad when Gordon sails through Wellsworth with the express, still teasing him. Gordon continues down the line, telling the coaches to hurry until he and his driver think they see something on the oncoming bridge. The driver shuts off steam, and as Gordon slows to a stop, he sees that the obstacle is a cow. He tries to shoo it, but the cow refuses to budge from her loneliness due to the fact that her calf has disappeared. Gordon's crew and the passengers try to get the cow to leave, but to no avail. Henry soon comes by with his train and also thinks that the cow can simply be ordered away, but is also unable to get her to move and nervously reverses so as to not hurt her. Once back at the station, Henry's guard tells the station master about the cow blocking the line. The porter realises that it is Bluebell, declaring that her calf is at the station and that they will send it to the bridge in a truck pulled by Percy. Arriving at the bridge, Percy reunites the calf with its mother, and the two cows are easily led away by the porter. Gordon and Henry make an agreement not to tell anyone about the incident, but the story quickly gets around. That night, Edward is ready to tease Gordon and Henry in the shed. Gordon defends himself and Henry, claiming that he stopped to prevent Bluebell from running up against them and hurting herself. Edward says that he understands, but Gordon worries that Edward understands all too well. It's just a fun episode with some cows walking onto the tracks, showing some railway realism, as this sort of thing would happen on the railways long before this story was written. Cows and other livestock would often wander onto the tracks, and Wilbert was quick to exploit this for his railway series. It's worth pointing out that for this episode, as well as the rest of the series, that Henry regains his wheel arches and his stepladders become solid. Because as we know in the first series, when Henry gets his new shape, his wheel arches are removed. But from this episode onwards, he gains them back. Sir Ringo Starr as always gives a wonderful narration in this episode. And while his cow impression isn't exactly the most realistic cowing and just a simple mooing, you have to admit that it is a better cow impression than what George Carlin did in the American version. And for all you American fans who may be watching, I am not taking the piss out of George Carlin's performance in this episode, no. He was a great narrator and he was a great comedian as well. But the way he makes the cow sounds in the American dub of the episode just sounds very unrealistic to me. And let's be honest, if they were going to get a narrator to get the cow to make a silly sound, I think that Stephen Fry would have been a better choice. But all that aside, this is another one of those episodes that has some firsts for this series, like the fact that Edward's getting old and his parts are wearing out. This is a thing that would go on throughout Series 2, and would eventually be concluded in a later episode, which we'll talk about later on. But I also love how Toby defends Edward against Gordon and Henry when they tease him about the cow incident.
You couldn't help it, Edward. They've never met cows. I have, and I know the trouble they are.
It's very fitting for this particular character to say this sort of thing, because it's very likely that he would have dealt with livestock wandering onto the tracks, being a tram engine and having cow catchers and all. Because as I said, livestock running onto the tracks is a common thing on railways. The funniest incidents I've ever seen is pheasants running onto the tracks when the train is running right in front of it. And they're so stupid that they just run right in front of the train, like run away from it until they eventually decide to get off the tracks. Because it's a well-known fact that pheasants are thick as shit. So it makes sense for Toby to be the one to back up Edward on this. Cows is another one of those nice simple episodes that just takes the time to show us a bit of railway realism and expand the characters as well. Having Gordon and Henry victimise Edward like they used to do in the first series, then Edward getting his own back when the same thing happens to the two of them. It's just an all-around fun episode which I highly recommend watching. This is one of those episodes that I used to rewatch a lot as a kid. On the VHS tape where I had those episodes as well as Magic Roundabout episodes, as well as Chasers, Races and Runaways. 18 episodes of Mischief and Mishaps, one of the greatest VHS tapes of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends of all time. And I think the Thomas community might kill me or something if I don't bring this line up.
That must be Bluebell, said the porter. Her calf is here, ready to go to market.
As we all know in the American dub, the line was changed to her calf is here looking for her mother, because the Americans apparently didn't want the idea of livestock being slaughtered to be in a kids show. It's funny how some things like that can fly over people's heads in the UK and yet it doesn't in America. Well, most of the time anyway. I guess American broadcasting companies are a lot more serious than British ones are. But this kind of dialogue would go over a kid's head, whereas an adult, and especially farmers, would know what they're talking about in a second. It's just another one of those random moments that makes the TV series a lot more adult than people give it credit for. So all around counts as a fun episode where nothing majorly exciting happens, there's no runaway, no chase scene, it's just a fun episode with livestock running onto the tracks. I highly recommend checking this one out if you haven't seen it for a while. It's a nice simple episode that you'll have a good time watching. Bertie's Chase, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book Edward the Blue Engine, is the third episode of the second series. This is an episode that has a bit more excitement in it, since as the title suggests, it involves a chase. One morning Edward is waiting at Wellsworth to pick up passengers for Thomas's train and is growing impatient. His fireman gets up on the cab route, but says he can only see Bertie, who is likely carrying tourists. With no sign of Thomas, they just leave the station. As they pass the level crossing, Bertie pulls up shouting that he has Thomas's passengers on board since Thomas's fireman is absent, but neither Edward nor his crew hear him. Bertie's driver tells him that they must keep their promise to Thomas and they start to chase Edward. Bertie tries to catch up with Edward, but to no avail. He soon finally reaches the top of a hill and sees Edward at Lower Sodor, stopped at a level crossing. Bertie tears down the hill at top speed, but the crossing gates close and Edward puffs away just as Bertie comes into the yard. Bertie is now both very upset and tired. He apologises to the passengers, who tell him not to worry and encourage him to start after Edward again. Bertie is not so sure, but his driver says that there is a good chance of catching Edward, as Bertie could climb hills better than him. After checking with the station master, Bertie sets off again. As they carry on, Edward comes to a hill. The coaches start grumbling, but soon they reach the top. Still oblivious about Bertie, they run smoothly into Upper Brandon. The guard blows his whistle, but as the driver looks back, he cannot see the green flag. Suddenly, Bertie comes into the station, and the station master tells the driver and guard what happened. Edward apologises for Bertie, who claims everything was his fault. Passengers board the train and cheer for Bertie. while Edward says goodbye and continues with his journey. Bertie heads off to tell Thomas that all is well. Thomas is grateful for Bertie and thanks him for being such a good friend. This was the second time in the series where Bertie the bus took the centre stage, and it is really fun and jam-packed like the first episode he was in, Thomas and Bertie. It once again has him racing after another engine, only this time it's Edward, and for different reasons besides being competitive. This episode also shows us a little bit more of Edward's personality. He is usually known for being a calm and patient engine, but there are times when he can get impatient, especially waiting for more passengers at the train when he's running late. And if you know your Railway series history, then you'll realise that this is not something that Brittlcroft and David Mitton created. This actually came from the very first Railway series book, The 3 Railway Engines. It was in the unadapted story Edward's Day Out, when Edward is so happy to take a passenger train for the first time in years, but then starts to grow impatient and worried that they'll be late on their journey when they're waiting for the guard. So it was nothing that Britt and David made up for Edward. This was all done by Robert Audrey years ago. And I simply can't talk about this episode without bringing up the fact that Sir Ringo Starr gets to sing again.
Oh dear, what can the matter be? Sang the fireman. Johnny is so long out. Never you mind about Johnny, laughed the driver. Just you climb on the cab and look for Thomas.
It's really quite fitting that he would sing Oh Dear What Can the Matter Be, since it was composed in England in 1780. And I just love how Edward's driver interrupts him by saying like, who cares about Johnny? Just see if you can find Thomas. That is freaking hilarious in my opinion. And it's one of those rare moments in the TV series where Ringo Starr really gets to shine with his singing talents. It's kind of weird how even though Bertie the Bus has a few other leading roles in the future of the series, this along with Thomas and Bertie are the only ones where Bertie's name is in the title. And we once again get to hear Bertie's amazing theme from the first series. As well as a slightly updated theme for the second series. It's a real joy to hear the original theme again, and it's really nice to hear an updated theme for the second series. It's one of those fun-packed episodes where there's nothing life-threatening or urgent that needs to be done aside from just getting passengers to a train. It's just a fun episode with a fun chase, and it's a nice bit of extra excitement after the previous episode. It's another one of those episodes that I do recommend checking out if you haven't seen it for a while, especially if you're a fan of Bertie the Bus. You'll get a lot of enjoyment out of this episode, and you'll get to see him interact with another engine aside from Thomas. So check it out and enjoy watching the chase for yourself.
Oh dear, what can the matter be? Johnny is so long out. Never you mind about Johnny.
The fourth episode of the second series, Saved from Scrap, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Edward the Blue Engine, is the first episode of Series 2 to introduce us to a brand new character, Trevor the Traction Engine. And it brings us another ongoing staple for the TV series, the theme of scrap. But I'll go through the story before I get into all that details. One day, Edward is heading to the scrapyard on his branch line. Thomas exclaims that Edward is not that old, but Edward knows that Thomas is only teasing. At the scrapyard, Edward sees a very unusual sight. A traction engine named Trevor who is very sad. Edward asks him why he's there at the scrapyard. The traction engine tells him that he is due to be broken up the following week. Though he is still clearly in working condition, his master decided he was old-fashioned. Edward remarks that he gets told the same thing, but the Fat Controller says he's a useful engine. Trevor then tells Edward about his old life. He would travel from farm to farm doing various jobs, and children would be excited to see him and took rides on him. He closes his eyes and remembers that he likes children.
Oh yes, I like children. Kids, is he okay? Like, is he on something?
Edward worriedly travels to the station, trying his hardest to think of a way to save Trevor. Edward tries to think who would take Trevor in, but had no luck. At Wellsworth, Edward spots the vicar and knows that he would be the perfect person to save Trevor. He and his driver explain about Trevor's situation and beg the vicar to save him. The vicar promises to go take a look. A few days later, Jem Cole tells Trevor about the vicar's upcoming visit and gives him a new coat of paint and a good polish in preparation. The vicar arrives and Trevor starts riding around the yard feeling happier than ever. Afterwards, the vicar talks to the scrapyard owner and is able to buy Trevor cheap. Now Trevor lives in the vicarage orchard, which is next to the line, and he and Edward see each other every day. Trevor enjoys his new work, but his favourite day of the year is the day of the church fete, where he has a wooden seat bolted to his bunker and gets to give children rides. And in the evening he is laying asleep in his shed thinking about the wonderful day he has had and the children he met. As I've said earlier, this episode was the introduction to Trevor the Traction Engine, who years later would become one of the most favoured and popular and iconic characters of the TV series as well as the Railway series. He is incredibly cheerful, kind and benevolent and gets along very well with nearly everyone. He enjoys basking in the sunshine or dozing in his shed, but easily grows bored and unhappy if he does not have much company or enough work to do. Trevor is particularly fond of children and loves giving them rides whenever he gets the chance. And I think it's impossible to talk about Trevor's love of children without in some way or form making fun of it.
Oh yes, I like children.
Okay, I'm gonna check him into a mental facility because something's wrong with him.
And I'm honestly not the first person to have made fun of this sort of factor about Trevor. It's been done for many years on the internet ever since YouTube was even made, but it doesn't ruin my childhood in any way or form. I just know it's all in good fun. We're also introduced to two new human characters. There's Jem Cole, who is a warm, loving father figure when looking after Trevor, but when it comes to farming, he could be a strict handyman just to ensure that his job is done professionally and flawlessly. He would also be known throughout the series to be really good at mechanics, since seasons later he would be asked by the Fat Controller to fix up Elizabeth the vintage lorry. And we also have the Vicar of Wellsworth, known as Reverend Charles Latsey, sometimes simply known as the Vicar. And he was the first person to address an engine crew by name.
Hello, Edward. You look upset. What's the matter, Charlie?
I honestly think that this is the only time in the TV series, as well as the Railway series, an engine crew would actually be known as by name, since we learn that Edward's driver's name is Charlie. But I don't recall any other time in the Railway series or the TV series where this has ever happened, making this the only one. The episode also brings up the factor of scrapping, which has become a huge staple in the Classics series since this episode. As we all know, scrapping throughout the TV series is something feared by steam engines, but it's quite amazing how Edward doesn't take it seriously when Thomas brings it up with him when he announces where he's going.
I'm going to the scrapyard today, Edward called to Thomas. What? Already? You're not that old, replied Thomas cheekily. Thomas was only teasing.
Edward of course brushes it aside because he knows that Thomas is only messing with him, and it's just Thomas being his cheerful old cheeky self. It's also worth pointing out that the first shot taken for the episode was actually from the cancelled adaptation of The Missing Coach, as James's tender could be seen at the end of the camera panning, similar to how James looks in the first shot of The Missing Coach. So the crew obviously decided to just use that scene for this episode, and it's just an iconic scene in my opinion, showing a bit of railway realism and one of the things that most people associate with in the railways: hard work in the yards. Is it just me, or is that double-decker bus in the background during the church fete near the end of the episode the original model for Bulgy? I mean, when you look at it really close up, it does look exactly like what Bulgy would eventually look like in the third series. So is it possible that they reused this model to create Bulgy? Anyway, saved from scrap was our introductions to Trevor the Traction Engine and the introduction to the scrapping theme. It's a nice heartwarming episode which introduces us to our favourite traction engine who will become one of the most popular characters in the TV series. Give this episode a watch if you haven't watched it for a while, as you'll see the origins of Trevor the Traction Engine. The 5th episode of the 2nd series, Old Iron, is based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Edward the Blue Engine. This is the first episode from series 2 to have a runaway, something that we've all come accustomed to in the series. So what's the story of the episode? One day, James is forced to wait at Wellsworth for Edward to arrive with his train. James is infuriated by this and grumbles about Edward being late again, though Edward finds it funny. That evening, even though it's still daylight, but what the hell, James is still grumbling when he puffs back to the shed. He complains to Thomas and Percy that Edward is always making the other engines wait and clanks about like a lot of old iron. Thomas and Percy are outraged at this remark and tell James that Edward could beat him in a race any day, to which James sarcastically says he would like to see. The next morning, James's driver suddenly falls ill and is sent home. With only his fireman on duty, James is relegated to shunt him for the day to his annoyance. After the fireman uncouples James from his trucks, the signalman spots James leaving with no one in his cab and sets the signals at danger to halt traffic down the line. And when he tells the fireman what happened, it turns out that 2 boys were seen on James's footplate fiddling with his controls, only to run when he started. The signalman's telephone rings with an engine inspector on the other end. After finishing the call, the signalman then tells the fireman to get a shunter's pole and a coil of wire rope. The inspector soon arrives in Edward and the fireman is ready with the pole and rope. With James's fireman and the inspector riding along with his own crew, Edward sets off. Meanwhile, James happily sails along the line, unaware that anything is wrong and simply glad to be free from shunting. No surprise there. Before long, his mood changes as he finds himself starting to go faster while realising that his cab is empty, and he starts to panic. By now, Edward is racing out of Knapford and heading down the line as fast as he can to catch up with James. Soon the two are almost neck and neck, with Edward giving it everything he can to keep up. The driver does his best to keep Edward steadily in line, while the inspector climbs outside and makes it to Edward's front with a noose of rope hanging from the shunting pole and tries to slip it over James's right buffer. It is difficult for the inspector, but he finally manages to catch the buffer and tie it to Edward's left one. James's fireman scrambles over to his cab and takes control, allowing both engines to finally slow down. As the 2 tired engines approach Crosby, James apologises for his early insult, which Edward accepts. Waiting for them on the platform is the Fat Controller. He congratulates the crew on their rescue and then tells James that he can rest before he takes the next train, while Edward is rewarded with a trip to the works to get his worn parts mended. Edward is delighted, remarking how nice it would be to run without clanking. You could make the argument that this might be the final episode of Edward's story arc for Series 2, but that's not really the case since his arc would carry on episodes later. This is the first episode from Series 2, as I said, to have a runaway, and it's just as exciting and enduring as the previous runaway episodes. It also begins the trend of James and Edward's relationship, something that the TV series would often exploit in future episodes, even when the show went downhill during the hit entertainment era. But we are here to talk about the good parts of Thomas the Tank Engine this year. This is one of the episodes from Series 2 that I often found myself rewatching tons of times when I had it on VHS. I think it was because of the runaway scene and some of the funny moments in the episode, like James's bad attitude towards Edward's running lateness. And I also love James's fireman's reaction to him being told the news about the boys fiddling with James's controls before he runs off.
2 boys were on James's footplate fiddling with the controls. Phew!
You may remember I made fun of that little reaction in one of my episodes of TTTE, having the cinnamon actually question why James's fireman was saying phew to the news, since you'd think he would be more shocked by it. Okay, so it's like this. 2 boys were on James's footplate fiddling with the controls. Phew! Wait, what do you mean phew? James is running away on his own, and all you can say is phew? Makes you wonder what must have been going through the fireman's head when he heard the news. Perhaps he thought there was a ghost on board or something, I don't know. The episode once again shows realism as the cinnamon halts all traffic along the line to avoid any crashes. Since James is a runaway engine, he wants to avoid any other engines and road vehicles and having a collision with James, preventing a serious accident. It's also super amazing how the large-scale cinnamon and firemen are in a Cinderbots interior that's quite close to the model set. It was like they purposely made this large-scale set just to fit it in with the scale models so that they could show the workings of the yards from inside the Cinderbots' windows. That is a super clever move that the team did right there. I also really love how James is starting to enjoy running down the line as fast as he can without having to do some shunting. because we all know James hates trucks and shunting and would rather pull coaches. It's just really nice to see James's enjoyment of it before he finally realises that he's in danger. And I love how Ringo Starr pulls off James's sudden realisation of it, going from very excited and laughing to extreme panicking.
Suddenly he was going faster and faster. He realised that he had no driver. What shall I do? I can't stop! Help! Help!
And the episode saw the return of the classic Runaway theme from Series 1. And they amped it up for this episode, making it feel more epic and life-threatening than the first time we heard it. Another thing that makes this episode stand out for me is the fact that James takes centre stage here, since he's been one of my favourite characters throughout the TV series. And I'm going to try not to talk about every single goof for this series because there's really no point to it since we all know them. But in the restored version of the episode, when the Fat Controller congratulates Edward's crew, we can see that the sky behind him is all black, whereas in the original version we saw actual sky. And I don't know what the hell that was about. I mean, did Hit Entertainment filter that sky when they remastered it for the DVD releases, or was it another Photoshop? It's just really weird that this would happen in the restored version of the episode. So after previous episodes of nice simple episodes and one chase episode, Old Iron is a really nice Runaway episode that the kids who enjoy Runaway episodes will really get behind and enjoy a lot. This is an episode that I can watch tons of times over and over again and never get tired of it, and I definitely recommend checking this one out. It's got a great Runaway, 2 great characters, and it's just an all-around great episode in my opinion. You'll get lots of entertainment out of it, and you'll love the Runaway.
Phew!
Thomas and Trevor, the 6th episode of the second series, wasn't based on any of the Railway series stories. It was instead based on an annual story of the same name written by Christopher Awdry. Trevor is sad when he does not have enough work to do, which he tells Edward during one of the Blue Engine's daily visits to the Vicar's orchard. Edward has some good news for Trevor. The Fat Controller has asked that he be sent to the side of the new harbour to help out with the work. Trevor instantly perks up, excited about getting to work and meeting children, of course. Edward brings him to the yard to meet Thomas. Upon meeting Trevor, Thomas, who is carrying metal pilings needed for the construction work, is initially sceptical of the newcomer. After Trevor's flatbed is coupled to Thomas's train, the two set off to the harbour. On the way, Trevor explains what type of work he can do and does not need rails to be used for. This helps Thomas understand Trevor better. Upon arrival at the harbour, they come across havoc. Trucks are derailed and blocking the line, and stone slabs are littered throughout the area. Thomas's driver tells the two that the equipment Thomas is carrying is essential, so Trevor mustn't go to work taking it around the mess. Trevor, who enjoys this kind of work, is happy to do his job as soon as possible. While Thomas moves the trucks, Trevor carries the construction equipment to where it is needed. Thomas soon brings Annie and Clabber to the harbour to meet him, and is left very impressed with Trevor after seeing him work so hard. This makes him finally understand how useful the traction engine can truly be. Both Annie and Clabber are carrying children, whom Trevor is more than happy to give rides around the beach. This is easily his favourite part of the day, and Annie and Clabber remark to each other on how kind and gentle Trevor is and how he reminds them of Thomas. Thomas and Trevor are both very sorry when the day is over and Trevor has to return to the orchard. Taking him to the junction, Thomas notices that he has a small tear coming from his eye. He pretends not to notice and cheers Trevor up by telling him that there is now plenty of work for him at the orchard, and that he could be needed at the harbour again soon. And that makes Trevor feel better. That evening, Trevor thinks about the day's events and falls happily asleep. Compared to the previous episode, Old Iron, this was an episode where nothing exciting or exhilarating happens. It's just a nice, calm episode that just shows the working life of Trevor the Traction Engine and Thomas. And it bears quite a few similarities to Thomas, Terence and the Snow, where Thomas is sceptical about Terence the Tractor, but then soon learns how useful he really is. And it makes sense for Thomas to be this way around Trevor at first, because he'd obviously never seen a traction engine before. As I mentioned earlier, this episode was based on an annual story rather than a Railway series story, but because it was still written by Christopher Awdry, that made it okay to use. And this is the first time we get to see a different type of harbour on the island rather than the one that was introduced in Series 1's episode The Flying Kipper. And it once again shows the industrial aspect that Series 2 had introduced. Though there is one quote from the episode that might raise a couple of eyebrows.
A small tear came into Trevor's eye. Thomas pretended not to see. He whistled gaily to make Trevor happy.
Now, people from today's generation might not be aware of this, but the term gay or gaily was usually used as a way to say if someone was happy, and it was commonly used back then before it started to just mean people who like the same sex. So this might go over people's heads and some people might roll their eyes about it, but it was from an old generation. So despite not being as action-packed as the previous episode, Thomas and Trevor didn't really need to be. I see it as a nice quick breather for people that just watched the previous episode. Something nice, simple and wholesome to look forward to before getting to more of the more exciting episodes later on in the series. And that ending monologue that Ringo Starr gives out is just so wholesome to me.
That evening, Trevor stood remembering his new friend Thomas, the harbour, and most of all, the children. Then he went happily to sleep in the shed at the bottom of the orchard.
It's one of his best performances in the show from my point of view. So for me, this episode's definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it for a while. It's a nice quick breather from the previous Runaway episode before we get to more exciting episodes later on in this series, and it's a great way to show more of Trevor the Traction Engine, a fan favourite among fans. Based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Percy the Small Engine, the 7th episode of the second series, Percy and the Signal, is the beginning of the Percy arc for Series 2. Of course, we were introduced to him back in the first series of the show, but we didn't have that much time to see who the character really was. We only got glimpses of his cheeky personality. Well, this series gives us a full blast at Percy, and this episode starts it all. Percy works in the yard, and although he works hard, he can also be very cheeky and often plays jokes. One day, Percy is feeling particularly cheeky. He startles Gordon by telling him that his train is ready, which makes Gordon think he's running late. Percy then pulls out to reveal a line of dirty trucks, which makes Gordon very cross. Gordon begins to think of a way to get back at Percy. Next, Percy goes to James and tells him that the Fat Controller had sent a message for him to stay in the shed until he comes to see him. James is delighted, thinking that the Fat Controller wants him to pull a special and refuses to leave when his driver and fireman try to take him out. As a result, the other engines have to do James's work as well as their own, which makes them very angry. Finally, an engine inspector arrives to find out why James won't leave his shed. James tells him about the message the Fat Controller supposedly sent. The inspector points out that the Fat Controller could not have sent a message as he is away for a week. James is furious, realising he was fooled, and quickly leaves to find Percy, but Percy has disappeared. When the Fat Controller returns, he tells both engines off for causing trouble. Sometime later the next morning, Percy is boasting to Gordon and James that he has taken trucks to Thomas's junction. He believes that the Fat Controller chose him because he is a really useful engine, though James thinks it's simply to keep him out of the way. Gordon, realising what route Percy has taken, indicates to James that they have a chance to give Percy a taste of his own medicine. It claimed they were talking about being careful with the signals at the junction, especially backing signals. Percy, keen to show off, claims that he knows all about signals, but worries as he has never heard of backing signals before. Percy soon arrives at a signal set at danger, but then sees its arm move to line clear. The small green engine is surprised when it moves up instead of down, having never seen anything like it before, and guesses that it's one of the backing signals Gordon and James were discussing. Percy begins reversing and his driver quickly stops him. Percy insists that it is a backing signal and tells him what Gordon and James had said. The driver tells Percy the truth, which makes him eager to leave before he is seen. But Gordon goes past and sees that Percy fell for the trick. Humiliated, the small engine quickly and quietly finishes his work. That night in the sheds, Gordon and James talk about nothing but signals. While they think it is funny, Percy thinks that they're being very silly. As I've said earlier, this episode really shows off Percy's personality compared to what we've seen in the first series. We all knew that he was quite cheeky and a hard worker from the first series, but we've never known to what extent his cheekiness could go to. And this episode reveals it, with him playing pranks on Gordon and James. It's sort of like a mirror to what Thomas was back in his starter days when he was shunting coaches for the big engines. And Sir Ringo Starr gives a wonderful performance as always for this episode. I especially love his performance to when James realises that he's been made a fool of.
Show a wheel, James. You can't stay here all day. The Fat Controller told me to stay here. He sent a message this morning. He did not. How could he? He's away for a week. Oh, said James. Oh, where's Percy?
And I'm very sure that the events of this episode, as well as the book it was based on, was based off of a real life event in railways. But I can't for the life of me figure out what that signal that goes up instead of down is from. So feel free to put a comment below if you know what that's all about, because I sure as hell have no idea. And I'm going to talk about an aspect of Series 2 that I haven't brought up before until this episode. And that's the use of the camera shots and panning. In the first series, we didn't get a lot of panning with the cameras, as the crew was still starting off with the camera work and working out what they could do with their abilities. But here we get panning shots galore. We pan past a big pile of coal before we get to Percy, Gordon and James in the big yards. And in previous episodes, we get to see close-up shots of the engines and the camera moves away from them. Since the team have moved to a big studio, they really did test what they could do with the cameras this time around. And this episode is another great example, where it shows us shots of the work in railway yards before we get to the story at hand. David Mitton just did a great use of the camera work here. And this goof that you find in the DVD version isn't exactly a huge deal, but it's a big deal to most fans nonetheless. It's that when the Fat Controller sees James and Percy about what happened with the whole trick thing, in the original version we get a close-up shot of James and then Percy before we cut to the next scene. Although in the DVD remastered version, we skip the scene with Percy entirely and just stay on James. And like with the previous goofs Hint Entertainment did in the DVD releases, I have no idea what drove them to make this mistake. But like I said, it's just a small detail and it's not nearly as bad as the mistake they made in the remastered version of Cole. Percy and the Signal is another one of those fun episodes where we get no runaways, no chase scenes. It's just a fun episode which shows us more of Percy's personality. And as I said, it's the start of his own story arc going through the series. So I'd highly recommend checking this episode out if you haven't seen it for a while. You'll get some good laughs out of it, you'll get to see more of Percy's personality, and it's just an all-around fun episode to watch. You won't be disappointed with Percy's antics. Dark Takes Charge is the 8th episode of the second series and is based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Percy the Small Engine. This is one of those huge landmarks for the series because it introduces us to another fan favourite, Duck the Great Western Engine. Let's go over the story. One day in the sheds, Percy is eager to tell Gordon and James some news. Both quickly tire of Percy's usual manner, and the tank engine tells them that as the work in the yard is getting too hard for him, the Fat Controller is planning to bring a new bigger engine to help. James scoffs and tells Percy that if he spent more time working and less time talking, the yard would be a happier place. Percy then leaves to do his work. As he works, Percy is grumbling to himself about how the larger engines see him as a silly little engine, ever since he misunderstood the signal and went backwards instead of forwards. Percy wants to teach them a lesson, but doesn't know how to do it. He works very hard all day and by the afternoon he is worn out. After bringing some express coaches to the station, he sees the Fat Controller on the platform, who notes that Percy looks very tired, which Percy confirms. The Fat Controller consoles Percy by telling him that the new engine is bigger than him and can probably manage the work alone. He then asks Percy if he would like to help Thomas build his new harbour, to which Percy happily agrees straight away. Soon the new engine arrives. The Fat Controller asks the engine his name, and the engine introduces himself as Montague, but tells the Fat Controller he is often called Duck due to his supposed waddle. Although Although he does not believe that he actually does waddle, he admits to liking Duck better than Montague. With that, the Fat Controller agrees that the new engine will be known as Duck. Percy arrives and the Fat Controller asks him to show Duck around. Duck does his work quietly as he brings some coaches to the station, leading Gordon, James and Henry to decide to boss him around just like they do with Percy. Gordon and Henry then start to leave the station on either side of Duck, quacking and blowing steam at him. Percy sees everything and is cross about it. Duck takes no notice and just wants to wait until the larger engines get tired of their teasing. Duck then asks Percy if the larger engines boss him around, and Percy confirms that they do. Duck decides to take charge and put a stop to it and tells Percy what they will do. That afternoon, the Fat Controller is sitting at his desk looking forward to having hot buttered toast for tea when he suddenly hears a horrible commotion coming from the yard. Looking out of his window, he sees Percy and Duck blocking the turntable and preventing an enraged Gordon, James and Henry from entering the sheds. The Fat Controller grabs his hat and rushes to the yard. At the sheds, Gordon, James and Henry are furiously wheezing and whistling loudly when the Fat Controller arrives and demands silence before demanding an explanation from Duck and Percy. Duck politely explains that as a Great Western engine, he prefers to do his work without any fuss, but wants the other engines to know that he and Percy only take orders from the Fat Controller. As the three larger engines start whistling angrily again, the Fat Controller silences them. He then tells Duck and Percy that he is pleased with their work that day, but not with their behaviour that night, as they have caused a disturbance. Gordon, Henry and James snigger at Percy and Duck's dilemma, but the Fat Controller turns back to the three larger engines and reprimands them too, as their actions have been much worse. He declares that they made the disturbance by ordering the two tank engines around and that Duck is right. That this is his railway and he is the one who gives the orders, not them. With that, the three engines quickly fall back into line. When Percy is sent to work at the harbour on Thomas's line, Duck is left to do the work alone, something he manages with ease. The episode, as I mentioned, introduces us to Duck the Great Western engine, a fan favourite among the Thomas community. He knows how to hold his own and tends to stand for no nonsense for many engines that might have ideas about their station and try to order him and others around.
Beg pardon, sir, but I'm a Great Western engine. We do our work without fuss, but begging your pardon, sir, Percy and I would be glad if you would inform these engines that we only take orders from you.
As a result of this and his strength, most tank engines look up to him. Duck tends to talk about the Great Western way, and how that's one of the only ways to do things, that and the Von way. But he's also a very kind, hard-working engine, and stands for no nonsense for many engines. And I think it's really nice and interesting to see a more cheeky side of Gordon, James and Henry rather than their usual boastful selves, as they've been said to order Percy about in the yards. And it's super hilarious how they make fun of Duck when they first meet him. And Sir Ringo Starr just really gives it his all when he does Gordon and Henry making fun of Duck with quacking and wheezing noises. It's just something that I could re-listen to all day and never get tired of. And that bit where Gordon, James and Henry stop outside the sheds to see Duck and Percy blocking the turntable, refusing to let them in. Those sound effects Ringo Starr does is quite hilarious too. I have no idea what that last sound effect was meant to represent, but all I know is it's funny as hell. The episode is also one of those rare occasions where Ringo Starr really does shout at the top of his lungs for a particular line. Well, two lines actually, and those two lines being from the Fat Controller. There's just so much oomph in his voice compared to the last series, and it's great to listen to when you rewatch this episode, especially after hearing Duck's point of view on the situation at the end.
Stop that noise, bellowed the Fat Controller. They won't let us in, hissed Gordon. Duck explained this behaviour. Beg pardon, sir, but I'm a Great Western engine. We do our work without fuss, but begging your pardon, sir, Percy and I would be glad if you would inform these engines that we only take orders from you. Snapped the Fat Controller.
Sir Ringo deserves an Oscar for that. As well as being introduced to Doug, we're also introduced to his theme, which has become really popular among the Thomas community, being remade by almost every YouTuber who's ever been a fan of Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell's music. And like every character theme, it really does show off Duck's personality, and it's just a grand sounding theme in my opinion. If you were to ask me if the Great Western Railway had a theme tune, and what would it be, then I would definitely say this tune. Duck Takes Charge is the second part of the Percy saga throughout Series 2, and it's definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it for a while. It's a great introduction to Duck, it's a great further telling of Percy's personality and his story arc throughout the series, and it's just an all-around fun episode to watch. You'll get lots of entertainment out of it, and you'll get to hear a top-notch performance from Sir Ringo Starr. Percy and Harold is the 9th episode of the second series, and is based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Percy the Small Engine. This episode introduces us to another fan favourite in the series, Harold the Helicopter. Is the story as good as we remember it? Let's take a look. Percy is now working at the new harbour on Thomas's branch line. He often has to fetch trucks, and although he works hard, he still likes his new job and prefers branch line work over shunting for the mainline engines at the big station. Along the branch line is an airfield, and Percy hears the planes flying overhead. The noisiest though is a helicopter, the noise of which Percy ends up complaining about. One day Percy stops his train at the airfield to talk to the helicopter, whose name is Harold. Percy compliments Harold for his big strong arms, and Harold responds by saying that he thinks railways are slow and out of date. When they finish, Harold flies away and Percy sets off for the quarry. Percy finds Toby and expresses his feelings about Harold. Afterwards, he collects his trucks and heads back to the harbour. On Percy's trip to the harbour, they hear Harold's unmistakable buzzing overhead. Percy's crew encourage him to race the helicopter, which Percy has never been allowed to do before and is excited. The trucks wail and beg Percy to stop, but it's no use. They have to slow down when they reach the wharf, and Percy is sure that they have lost the race. But when the fireman climbs onto the cab roof, he realises that they've won, as he can see Harold still hovering and looking for a place to land. In celebration of Percy's victory, the fireman sings a song about the race which Percy loves, especially the last line. This is one of the more exciting episodes of the second series, as we get to see another race this time. Except instead of Thomas and Bertie the bus having a race, it's a race between Percy and Harold the helicopter. And this is the first story where Harold gets to shine. In this episode, Harold is shown to be very proud of being able to fly, and the speed and versatility this gives him. He somewhat tends to be very cocky, as he believed that railways are slow and quite out of date. This caused a bit of a rivalry between him and the engines, particularly Percy, and he is usually nicknamed Whirlybird for that. But he usually got his comeuppance in the end. Despite this little flaw in him, Harold is always helpful and highly alert whenever there is an emergency, especially when he's on patrol. Because of this, he remains a friend to the railway. He also speaks in a manner reminiscent of an RAF pilot, using such terms as wizard and old chap in conversation. This episode was so popular among the Thomas fans as well as the staff for the TV series, so much so that it got mentioned many times in future episodes, and there was even a flashback to it in the series episode Letters to Santa. And having looked on Thomas Wiki for screenshots of the episode for this review, I found out that a possible basis for this episode was when Flying Scotsman was racing a helicopter back in the days. It's really amazing that the Scotsman inspired quite a few stories for Thomas the Tank Engine. And we also get to hear Sir Ringo Starr's singing talent in this episode once again with the victory song for Percy after the race.
Said Harold Helicopter to our Percy, you are slow. Your railway is out of date and not much use, you know. But Percy with his stone trucks did the trip in record time, and we beat the helicopter on our old branch line.
How has this guy not gotten an Oscar or Tony for his performance in the TV series? Harold and Percy is another one of those episodes that I really do recommend watching if you haven't watched it for a while. It's an enjoyable racing episode that was really made for the people who love races. And it'll get you hyped to see Harold the helicopter for the first time. So if you haven't seen this for a while, check it out. You won't be disappointed with the fun race.
Said Harold helicopter to our Percy, you are slow. Your railway is out of date and not much use, you know. But Percy with his stone trucks did the trip in record time, and we beat the helicopter on our old branch line.
The 10th episode of the second series, The Runaway, is based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, More About Thomas the Tank Engine. This was the second Runaway episode for the second series, but is it as exciting as Old Iron? Let's take a look. One day, Thomas wakes up feeling ill. The workmen are unable to make him feel better, so the Fat Controller has Edward bring Thomas to the works for a while and asks Duck to take over Thomas's duties on his branch line. Duck is delighted to be given such responsibility. Duck is already friends with Percy and quickly befriends Toby, Bertie and Terence the Tractor, who tells Duck to take extra special care with Annie and Clarabelle. Duck is very gentle with them and both coaches are left very impressed with the Great Western engine and remark what a pleasure it is to go out with him. When Thomas returns from the works, the two coaches tell him how well Duck had managed on the line. Thomas does not feel jealous, as he is just happy to be back home. Although Thomas feels better, he is not in complete working order. The repairs had left his handbrake very stiff, meaning it can feel like his brakes are hard on when they actually are not. Because of this, Thomas begins to overrun the station platform, which causes him a great deal of embarrassment. Eventually his crew learn to be extra careful with the handbrake and make sure to stop in the right place. When Thomas's fireman falls ill one day, a relief man takes his place. After Thomas arrives at the junction, the new fireman couples him up to Annie and Clarabelle, then joins the driver and station master on the platform while they wait for Henry to deliver his passengers. However, the firemen have forgotten about the stiff handbrake. When Henry starts to approach with his passengers, Thomas's wheels start to move as his brakes are not completely on, and he cannot stop nor whistle a warning without his crew. Before anyone realises what has happened, Thomas has left everyone stranded on the platform and runs off without anyone in his cab. Annie and Clarabelle scream for Thomas to stop, but he has plenty of steam and keeps going. Soon an alarm goes out about the runaway train. An engine inspector makes a plan, boards Harold the helicopter and flies to a station where Thomas is due to pass by. When Thomas reaches the station, he is very tired and is moving far slower than normal. But then he sees Harold landing near the next station. The inspector then makes it to the platform, and when Thomas passes, he scrambles aboard the cab and puts Thomas's brake hard on. Having finally brought Thomas to a stop, both he and the inspector are very relieved and thank Harold, who tells them that it was no problem. The inspector tells Thomas that they must make sure this never happens again. Feeling exhausted, Thomas agrees with him. This was the second story to be based on Christopher Aldry's book, More About Thomas the Tank Engine, and I've always found myself re-watching this episode a lot when I watched it on VHS, whether it be from Percy, Harold and other stories or Chases, Races and Runaways. This is one of those episodes that I would re-watch countless times. And even though the runaway in this episode doesn't last as long as it did in Old Iron, I still enjoy it to a certain degree. The episode also hints that Thomas and Duck might have a bit of a rivalry with each other. Well, I wouldn't exactly say rivalry, it's more like a certain dislikement of each other, since it's hinted that Thomas was jealous of how well Duck had managed with Annie and Clarabelle, and they even showed their on and off relationship throughout the series in the CGI series when Duck was brought back. But for me, the biggest highlight of the episode is seeing Harold the helicopter in action again. This episode pictures him like a hero to the island of Sodor. especially with his theme tune. And I wanted to save talking about his theme tune till this episode, despite it being introduced in Percy and Harold, because we get to hear the full version of it in this episode. It just sounds so heroic and grand. And it might be one of the best themes that Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell have ever composed for the series. It just sounds like the kind of theme that a superhero would have. And the team in the TV series even pictured Harold as a superhero, since in Series 5 they made a music video based on him, which pictured him like a hero to the railway. So we get to see the more heroic side of Harold in this episode. The Runaway might not exactly have the same amount of excitement and thrills as the Hold Iron did in their Runaways, but I still love this episode nonetheless. It's one of the many episodes that I rewatched countless times as a kid, and I still look forward to rewatching when I put the DVD on. It's definitely worth checking out if you love the Runaway stories. And you'll get to see Howard the Helicopter in action as a superhero. It's definitely worth a watch. Another fan favourite episode among fans is Percy Takes the Plunge, the 11th episode of the second series based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, The 8 Famous Engines. After taking a short break from Percy's stories, this one shows Percy again in full force. At Brendam, a tired Henry is looking to rest. However, he is annoyed to find Percy telling Bill and Ben about the time he had braved bad weather to help Thomas's passengers return home. Percy claims that water's nothing to an engine with determination, while the twins shower him with praise. Henry arrives and angrily sends them away, claiming that the shed is only for engines belonging to the Fat Controller and calls them silly. Percy is furious at him because he was enjoying telling Bill and Ben his story. Henry also thinks Percy is also silly for his remark about water. Percy runs off, sinning about the time Henry refused to leave the tunnel in case the rain spoiled his paint, to Henry's annoyance as he huffs to himself that no one will ever let him forget that incident. Percy finds Thomas looking at a danger board on the quayside. Thomas tells Percy that they must not go past it, recalling when he passed it and fell down a mine. What Percy doesn't realise is that the foundations of the quay had sunk, causing the tracks to slope downward into the sea. As a result, Percy, who is now feeling very cheeky, remarks that the board is stupid and makes a plan to pass it. One day, Percy is taking a line of trucks to the harbour. He secretly asks them to give him a bump once they get to the quay. The trucks happily agree, having never been asked to bump an engine before. Percy thinks that he can stop the trucks whenever he likes, but every wise engine knows that you cannot trust trucks. At the quay, Percy stops before the board, convinced his plan will work, but the trucks seize the opportunity and bump Percy hard enough to knock his crew off the footplate. Percy is frantic and urges the trucks to stop, but they ignore him and cause him to slide downward into the sea. The Fat Controller arrives on the boat and disciplines Percy for his deliberate recklessness and disobedience. Percy begs to be get out, but the Fat Controller informs him that it cannot be done until high tide, and hopes that it will teach Percy to obey orders and listen. When night falls, floating cranes are brought in to hoist Percy from the sea onto a flatbed, as he has become too cold, filthy and stiff to move. The next morning, Percy is arranged to be taken to the works for cleaning and mending on Henry's goods train. Henry finds the incident very amusing, telling Percy that he needs more determination and suggesting that he would like it better next time. Percy, however, is determined that there will not be a next time. This episode for some reason takes place before Percy Takes the Plunge, which wouldn't be adapted until the third series of the TV series. So when you watch this episode as a grown-up, it feels kind of odd watching this episode even though we haven't seen the events of Percy Takes the Plunge just yet. And I did mention in my review of Thomas, Percy and Nicole that Percy's Promise was actually intended to be adapted for the series, but then they cancelled it at the last minute. It was probably due to the fact that they didn't really have the technology to put an engine fully in water just yet. Obviously they could handle the front end of an engine being going in water without damaging it. They must not have had the budget to have water damaged an engine just to rebuild it later on. So they had to save it till the third series. But we'll cover that episode when we get to it next year. The other major difference from the Railway series story, aside from skipping Percy's promise, is that in the original story, Percy tells his story to a group of unnamed friends from the other Railway, whereas in the episode Bill and Ben take their place due to the impracticality and high cost of constructing several single-use engines. And that really does make sense, since the team would want to spend the money on characters that they're going to use again rather than one-off characters that we'll never see again. And as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't in the budget. And I love the continuity that this episode brings, since it reminds us of the events of Down the Mine, since Thomas recalls it from looking at the danger sign at the quay, which is the exact same sign that was used in Down the Mine. And the events of the episode were mentioned by the narrator in the special Tale of the Brave, by Percy in Big World Big Adventures during the song Where in the World is Thomas, and by James in the 23rd series episode Troublesome Trucks, with CGI recreations of the scene where Percy plunges into the water. It's just really nice that this episode has continuity for the first series, and it continues to be mentioned throughout the TV series years later. And if you look very carefully in this scene, you'll be able to find a character that wouldn't be properly introduced until the next episode. And this episode was also the first for the Troublesome Trucks to take centre stage in Series 2, causing a derailment of an engine. Except this time they were asked to do it. And of course you can't blame the trucks for the accident because Percy should have known better than to trust them. Since most engines on Sodor know how troublesome trucks can be, Percy obviously wasn't to know since he'd never seen their cheeky side before this episode. So in a way the episode teaches kids to be careful who you trust. It's a really nice lesson to teach kids. And it's really awesome to see a huge harbour set in the second series. In the first series we did get to see a harbour, but it was just a small set. But here we get to see lots of boats, so much water, and a lot of machinery around the place. This has to be the most industrial scene for the second series, and we continue to see big harbours for years to come after this episode. Percy Takes the Plunge is another one of those iconic episodes that most Thomas fans remember throughout the years. And it's definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it for a while. You'll enjoy seeing Percy's accident, you'll get a kick out of seeing a huge harbour set, and it's just an all-around fun episode that gives us continuity from the first series. Give it a watch. I bet you guys have been waiting for me to cover this episode since I started this year, haven't you? Pop Goes the Diesel, the 12th episode of the second series based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Duck and the Diesel Engine. This was the start of what fans called the Duck and the Diesel trilogy for the TV series. And it introduces us to the first main villain of the TV series, Devious Diesel. Duck the Great Western Engine works very hard on the island of Sodor and everything goes smoothly when he is around. He can keep the coaches quiet, the trucks behaving, and the passengers happy. He is also very proud of his Great Western heritage and talks endlessly about it, which irritates the larger engines, who quickly grow tired of hearing about the Great Western Way. One day, a visitor arrives at the shed. The Fat Controller introduces the new engine as Diesel, stating that he has agreed to give him a trial, and charges Duck with showing him around and teaching him what to do. Diesel introduces himself before heaping compliments on Gordon, James and Henry, who are in awe by his flattery. Duck, however, takes a dislike to Diesel's oily nature and shows him to the yard, where it becomes apparent that Duck's dislike of Diesel is mutual as Duck orders Diesel to refer to the Fat Controller as Sir Topham Hatt, before Diesel smugly tells Duck that he does not have to be taught what to do, saying that Diesels know everything and come to a yard to improve it, dubbing himself as revolutionary. Duck is not impressed with Diesel's boasting and orders him to arrange the trucks while he leaves to take Gordon's coaches to the station. Eager for the chance to show off, Diesel quickly gets to work. When Duck returns, he finds Diesel trying to move some very old and near defected trucks with stiff joints and brakes from a siding. Duck decides to let the events play out and watches with interest. Diesel struggles to move the trucks and gets so forceful with them that some of their brakes snap and the gear jams in the sleepers, causing several of the trucks to derail and overturn in the process. Diesel tries to push the remaining trucks back, but he still cannot move them and is forced to give up. As Duck finally comes around carrying some other trucks, Diesel asks Duck why he didn't tell him about this when he had gone through so much trouble. Duck replies that Diesel never asked him, and that he was having such fun being revolutionary. Duck leaves happily while Diesel fumes angrily. Diesel is later forced to help the workmen clear up the mess, a job that he hates, especially as the trucks have started laughing and singing a degrading song at him. When the cleanup is over, Diesel, now cross with the trucks and with Duck, steams off back to the sheds to sulk. This episode was the start of the Duck and the Diesel trilogy, and it was our introduction to Devious Diesel, the first main villain for the island of Sodor. When he first arrives on the island, Diesel seems to be a very polite engine who wants to prove himself a really useful engine. But when he is alone with Duck in the yards, he starts to show his true colours of how oily he is and how very proud he is to be the first Diesel on Sodor. And he was also shown to be extremely boastful of how revolutionary diesels were at the time, since he was introduced during the years when diesels were introduced to the railways, as a possible replacement for steam engines.
Your worthy Sir Topham Hatt thinks I need to learn. He is mistaken. We diesels don't need to learn. We know everything. We come to a yard and improve it. We are revolutionary.
Diesel is based on a British Rail Class 8 diesel electric shunter, one of the most iconic designs in Railway, and this design would be used for other diesel characters in the future of the series. And this is another episode where Ringo Starr really puts his all into his performance, especially when he has to do Diesel's growls.
Push! Backward! Forward! Oh! We can't! We won't! We can't! We won't! Some of their brakes snapped and the gear jammed in the sleepers.
And I don't know if I'm the only one here, but this episode kinda scared me as a kid. Mostly with the scene when Diesel was trying to shunt those old trucks. Because of his shouting, the trucks' reactions, and Diesel's angry growls. It just scared me a little bit as a kid. But unlike Off the Rails, this episode never scared me to the point where I never went near it again. I just enjoyed it so much. Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell also give us a brand new version of the breakdown theme from Series 1, making it more tense than it was the first time we heard it. And I know the Troublesome trucks were given their grey faces prior to this episode, but I wanted to save it for this episode because this is where we really got to see those faces shine. In the first series, their faces were originally just eyes and mouths glued onto trucks, but here they get the standard grey faces that we would know them to have to this day. And I love these new faces. It gives them the chance to show off their many expressions, and they look as mischievous as you would have believed the trucks to be. And we also get to see a new side of the Troublesome trucks that isn't just teasing and mocking the engines and causing them to have runaways and crashes. It's their playful side when they make up an insulting song about Diesel after his mishap. And it also gives Sir Ringo Starr the chance to sing again.
Cooks are waiting in the yard, packing them with diesel. Show the world what I can do, gaily boasts the diesel. In and out he creeps about like a big black weasel. When he pulls the wrong trucks out, pop goes the diesel.
The title of the song Pop Goes the Diesel is a pun on the nursery rhyme Pop Goes the Weasel. And the tune was actually used as a bass for that song. And it's become one of the most iconic and popular tunes for the TV series. And when you listen to the tune without Ringo Starr or George Carlin's versions of the song, it makes them sound like Alvin and the Chipmunks because of their high-pitched, squeaky voices. And I don't know if I'm the only one here as well, but whenever I hear the Troublesome trucks laugh from the second series onwards, I always used to think they sounded like giggling monkeys. I don't know why, it just for some reason sounded very monkey-like to me. And with Diesel being introduced, it would also start the trend of the steam engines versus diesels thing that would go on throughout the TV series. And of course they take it much further in the third series. But this is where we get to see a nice glimpse of it. How diesels were being introduced to railways, and the steam engines were starting to become the thing of the past. But that would be expanded upon in the third series, which we'll get to next year. Pop Goes the Diesel is another one of those episodes that remains iconic and a fan favourite throughout the Thomas community. It's definitely worth a watch if you haven't watched it for a while. You'll be introduced to Devious Diesel, you'll get to hear the Troublesome Trucks' first song ever in the TV series, and it's the start of the rivalry between Diesel and Duck. So if you haven't seen it for a while, check it out, and we'll get to see part 2 of this story tomorrow. But for now, take it away, Sir Ringo Starr and Troublesome Trucks.
Trucks are waiting in the yard, packing them with diesel. Show the world what I can do, gaily boasts the diesel. In and out he creeps about, like a big black weasel. When he pulls the wrong trucks out, up goes the diesel. Arr, growled Diesel, and scuttled away to sulk in the shed.
You guys know you're glad I didn't start talking till that song ended. Dirty Work, the 13th episode of the second series, is based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Duck and the Diesel. This is the second part of the Duck and the Diesel saga, as it takes place directly after the events of Pop Goes the Diesel. Diesel is still having a hard time having been made to look silly in front of the trucks as they continue to laugh and sing rude songs. Duck soon overhears the sinning and firmly bumps the trucks to stop them. Duck apologises for the truck's behaviour, but Diesel, still furious, blames Duck for making them laugh at him. Henry, watching nearby with James and Gordon, objects, saying that Duck would never do such a thing, and adds that while he, James and Gordon have their differences with Duck, they would never tell the trucks about them, since it would be, well...
Disgraceful, said Gordon. Disgusting, put in James. Despicable, finished Henry.
That's the phrase. By now, Diesel's anger towards Duck has grown to such a point where he wants to find a way to get rid of him. Inspired by the engine's words about the trucks, he makes a plan to spread lies. Going into the yard the next day, Diesel tells the trucks that he laughed at their joke about him and tells them some about the bigger engines and claims that he heard them from Duck. Before leaving, he warns them not to say that he told them. The trucks of course find these jokes hilarious and laugh at the bigger engines and tell them that they came from Duck, to get even with him for forcing them to behave. But even Duck is responsible for the trucks' ridicule. The engines hold a meeting and agree that Duck needs to be taught a lesson. They decide that since he once prevented them from entering the sheds, they will do the same to him. Later, Duck returns to the sheds exhausted after a long, hard day's work. However, when he tries to get back inside for a rest, the bigger engines stand close together and hiss steam at him. They tell him that because he tells tales about them to the trucks, they hate him and want Diesel to replace him. Duck starts to argue with them, but before long the Fat Controller arrives to break them up and see what the commotion is. He hears the bigger engines' accusations against Duck, and while trying not to laugh himself, gives Duck a chance to explain himself. Duck swears that he did not make these jokes and that no steam engine would be that mean. Diesel then comes forward and the Fat Controller asks him what he knows. Diesel fakes being shocked at Duck's actions, but claims ignorance otherwise. The Fat Controller apologises to Duck, saying that until he gets to the bottom of the incident that he must go to Edward's station at Wellsworth for a while, and reassures him that Edward would be happy to see him. Believing that the Fat Controller has turned against him too, Duck sadly obliges, and as Diesel watches him puff away, he gives a satisfied smirk. As I mentioned, this episode takes place not long after the events of Pop Goes the Diesel, and it's a really enjoyable continuation of the story, seeing how far the joke had gotten with Diesel and what pushed him over the edge. Because in the previous episode he started off as seemingly nice and polite, but a bit of a show-off as well. And in Dirty Work we get to see his devious side, which he became famous for, hence the nickname. The episode also brought on one of the many popular quotes that turned into a meme for the TV series, that being said by James, Gordon and Henry.
We engines have our differences, but we never talk about them to the trucks. That would be disgraceful, said Gordon. Disgusting, put in James. Despicable, finished Henry.
Classic. The episode also has two valuable lessons within it. First one being about how bad it is to lie. Whether you're trying to hurt someone or get out of trouble, a lie is a lie, and the more you do it, the more it becomes a habit. And the other lesson is about jumping to conclusions before knowing the truth, which was exactly what Gordon, James and Henry did. They just went by these rumours that were spread about by the Troublesome trucks that was originally spread by Diseasel, and just automatically jumped to conclusions before they found out what the truth was. Those are two things that you should never do. And that's really great lessons to teach kids. Take lessons from that, most current children's shows of today. The episode also has a change that's very similar to the change they did in Tenders and Turntables, where they add in an explanation as to what Diesel's plan is for Doug.
Diesel hated Doug. He wanted him to be sent away, so he made a plan. He was going to tell lies about Doug.
They did the same thing in Tenders and Turntables, where Sir Ringo Starr announced at the end that the engines were going to go on strike. The episode also led to Christopher Awdry writing 3 annual stories based on this episode, giving us some full details about how Diesel came up with those insulting nicknames for Gordon, James and Henry. The stories being Galloping Sausage, Rusty Red Scrap Iron, and Old Square Wheels. I like how Wilbert Awdry's son did a sort of prequel to the insults of this story for an annual. And like all episodes I've covered for Series 2 so far, you have to admire Sir Ringo Starr's performance in this one.
Duck called me a galloping sausage, spluttered Gordon. Rusty red scrap iron, hissed James. I'm Old Square Wheels, fumed Henry. Well, Duck considered. I only wish, sir, he said gravely, that I'd thought of those names myself, if the dome fits. He made trucks laugh at us, accused the engines. The Fat Controller recovered. He'd been trying not to laugh himself.
Oscar worthy. I especially love his delivery when Diesel tells a lie that he knows nothing of what's been going on in the yard.
I can't understand it, sir. To think that Duck of all engines. I am dreadfully grieved, sir, but know nothing. I see, said the Fat Controller. Diesel squirmed and hoped he didn't.
And when you watch the episode years later, you can sort of tell that the Fat Controller's response to Diesel's lies and sort of hints to the fact that he knows that Diesel's probably bullshitting him and that he knows more than what he's letting on. And it's also the first sad ending we get for the second series. I think this has to be one of the saddest endings we've gotten for the TV series since the sad story of Henry's ending. Just seeing Duck run off sadly to Edward's station while the other engines think he's horrid, making it seem like Diesel has won the day. But whether or not he has won the day, you'll have to find out tomorrow. But if you've watched the TV series throughout your whole life, I'm sure you'll know the answer. But if you want to see the answers anyway, stick around for tomorrow. Dirty Work is another great episode for the TV series in my opinion. It shows off Diesel's devious side, it has a sad ending which makes you really want to know what's going to happen next, and it's just an all-around fun episode where you get to see the Troublesome trucks in full force again. And it has a great callback to Duck Takes Charge as well. Rewatch this if you haven't seen it for a while. It's definitely worth your time.
Duck trundled sadly away while Diesel smirked with triumph.
A Close Shave, not to be confused with the famous Wallace and Gromit film, is the 14th episode of the second series based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book Duck and the Diesel Engine. This is the third and final part of the Duck and the Diesel saga for the second series. But is it a satisfying conclusion to the story? Let's take a look. After being framed by Diesel for telling lies about the big engines to the Troublesome trucks, Duck sadly goes to Wellsworth and tells Edward what has happened. And it's a great brief recap of the previous episode.
Diesel has been telling lies about me and made the Fat Controller and all the engines think I'm horrid.
Short, sweet and to the point. Edward assures Duck that everything will be alright and suggests helping him with his goods train, which cheers Duck up. The two engines work hard all afternoon to make the trucks behave while taking them up Gordon's Hill. Once at the top, Duck says goodbye to Edward and heads back to the station. As he coasts down the hill, enjoying the breeze, he suddenly hears a guard's whistle. He has been knocked out of the brake van as Edward's trucks have broken away and are racing back towards Duck at breathtaking speed, intending to derail him. Duck hurries through Wellsworth, trying his hardest to outrun the trucks, but they gradually catch up to him on the viaduct and begin pushing him. Just as they are starting to regain control, Duck and his driver see James ahead on the same track, pulling a passenger train out of Crosby Station. Duck puts all of his weight against the trucks but is unable to stop. He shuts his eyes and prepares for the worst, but gets diverted into a siding at the last second after being slowed down enough for James and his coaches to clear the platform in points. At the end of the siding is a small barber shop. As the barber is shaving a customer, Duck is pushed by the trucks into the end of the siding, comes off the rails and crashes right into the front of the shop, destroying the wall. Some trucks derail as well, but pay no attention to this, feeling rather pleased with themselves having successfully derailed Duck. As Duck stares nervously at the crowd in front of him, he tries to apologise, but the barber is furious with Duck for frightening his customers and firmly covers his face with shaving cream. Thomas arrives to help clear the mess, and soon the Fat Controller comes to speak with the barber, who is still fuming. The Fat Controller explains that Duck and his crew helped to prevent a much larger accident with James, adding that it was a very close shave. The barber quickly washes the lather off of Duck's face and apologises for misjudging him. After the trucks have been pulled away, Thomas pulls Duck out of the wrecked barber shop, and the Fat Controller tells him that he will be returning to the yard once he's mended. Duck is worried, believing that the big engines still hate him. The Fat Controller, however, replies that he never believed Diesel and sent him back to the other railway. The other engines are now sorry and want Duck to come back. A few days later, after being mended, Duck returns to the shed where the other engines welcome him back with happy whistles, as he proudly takes his place among them. This, as I said, is the conclusion to the Duck and the Diesel saga, but one thing about it that rubs people the wrong way all these years is the fact that we don't actually see Diesel getting sent away. We just hear the Fat Controller say that,
I never believed Diesel, so I sent him packing. The engines are sorry and want you back.
and that's it. We never get a visual evidence of him being sent away. Then again, the same thing happened in the book as well, so obviously the team were sticking loyal to the source material. Nevertheless, this led to a lot of fans on YouTube thinking of their own ways to fill in the gap, showing what could have happened in between Duck leaving the yards and Duck crashing into the barber shop, just to fill in the gaps themselves. I suppose that's the real joy of not seeing Diesel's punishment, leaving the audience to use their imaginations to fill in the blanks. The episode even gives us another runaway and crash scene, with Duck running away from troublesome trucks and crashing into the front of a barber shop. And it's become one of the most iconic crashes within the TV series, since most people talk about it and most people include it within their crash culmination videos on YouTube. And it's really funny to see Duck being covered with shaving cream.
Beg pardon, sir, gasped Duck. Excuse my intrusion. No, I won't, said the barber. You frighten my customers. I'll teach you. And he lathered Duck's face all over.
I object on the grounds that the plaintiff is being a little bitch about this whole thing. He should just be happy he's alive.
And years later, I find this line super hilarious.
I do not like engines popping through my walls, fumed the barber.
The way the barber says it almost makes it feel like it happens to him regularly, as if he's opened up other barber shops and sidings in other places and it's happened before. I don't know if he meant it like that, but it just seems that way the way Sir Ringo Starr delivered it. It's just super hilarious in my opinion. And speaking of the scenes inside the barber shop, they use a large-scale model of Duck to fit in with the large-scale models of the barber and his customers. And the face that was used for Duck was originally intended for Thomas's large-scale model. And this is the second opportunity in the second series where we get to hear the Series 2 version of the Runaway theme. Of course, it's another version of it with a different ending. And the ending for this version of it is a lot more dramatic than the previous one, really showing off the impact of the crash. Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell really were geniuses when it came to their music themes for the series, and it surprises me that they never won any awards for it. That I know of. Despite the fact that we don't actually see Diesel getting his punishment and being sent away in disgrace, I find A Close Shave to be a really satisfying ending to the Duck and the Diesel saga. It's got a really enjoyable runaway and crash scene for the fans that love runaways and crashes. And as I mentioned, the barber putting shaving cream on Duck's face is super hilarious and one of the most iconic images for the TV series. and it has a happy ending that's really satisfying after seeing the sad ending of dirty work. So I would definitely recommend checking this episode out if you haven't seen it for a while. If you're going to watch this episode, I'd suggest going back to Pop Goes the Diesel and watching that, then Dirty Work before Close Shave. It's 3 stories that's really meant to be seen in a marathon. It's one of the best sagas for the TV series, and it introduces the rivalry of Duck and Diesel, as well as diesel engines and steam engines. Check this episode out if you haven't for a while. It's got a great runaway scene, a great crash scene, and it's just an all-around great Duck the Great Western Engine episode. The 15th episode of the second series, based on the story of the same name for the Railway series book, more about Thomas the Tank Engine, Better Late Than Never is considered to be one of the worst episodes for the second series, as well as the series in general. You know, in the days before Hit Entertainment took over. But is it really as bad as people say it is? Let's take a look. Work has become difficult for the engines on the island of Sodor as the viaduct on the main line is being repaired, with the arches being strengthened. As the Fat Controller is unwilling to close the railway during repairs, the work is taking a long time and all the engines crossing the viaduct must cross slowly and carefully so as to safely avoid it collapsing under them. Because of this, the engines are often late making it to the junction where Thomas waits for his passengers. Thomas grumbles about this to Henry, who defends himself by telling Thomas that they have to reduce their speed during the repair work. Thomas, however, isn't prepared to listen and leaves to try to make up for lost time. Normally, when Thomas stops at Tidmouth Station, Bertie arrives soon after and his passengers go straight from him to their train. But because the larger engines are late for Thomas, he is late for Bertie's passengers, and now they often find themselves waiting on the platform. This makes Bertie cross with Thomas, whom Bertie tells when he arrives that he thought that Thomas could go faster than that. He then remarks that they should have another race, thinking he could now beat him, angering the exhausted Thomas, who blames the mainline engines for dithering on their viaduct and claims it to be an excuse for laziness. Another day, James arrives later than ever. He apologises, stating that a hold-up at Cronk Station combined with the delay at the viaduct contributed to this lateness. Thomas, as usual, has no interest in excuses, seeing this actual circumstance as a bad excuse, and leaves grumbling. He attempts to reach the station as fast as he can, but is unable to make up much time. However, things change when Thomas spots Bertie at a level crossing with his radiator steaming. Thomas tells Bertie he is late, but Bertie tells Thomas that he feels dreadful and his driver cannot repair him. Thomas running so late brings a bit of relief, as he can now pick up the passengers at this point instead of leaving them stranded. Thomas no longer feels cross and is sorry for Bertie, and promises to send for help at the next station. Thomas leaves with Bertie's passengers on board and brings them home safely. Once Bertie is repaired, he and Thomas make up for their argument and both agree that sometimes being late is not such a bad thing after all, and then they return to work. Many Thomas fans consider this episode to be one of the worst episodes of the second series, as well as the classic series in general. But I personally disagree with those accusations. I think it's mainly due to the fact that not that much goes on in the episode. But I honestly don't mind that. I see it as a nice quick breather from the events of A Close Shave before we get into the next episode. And it's also a scenario I can actually relate to. People being late for stuff. Because I have to take taxi rides to my current job at the hospital, and the first taxi company I went with started running late a lot, which made me late for work, and they made me late coming home as well. And in the end I had to give them the boot and go to a much better taxi company. And because of this I always felt the same way that Thomas did in this episode, seeing the driver's lateness as being an excuse for laziness. So it's a scenario I can honestly relate to. And this episode does have a lot of goods in it as well, like introducing us to the classic busy theme that Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell composed. It just adds to the busy life of the island, especially when you see the repair works on the viaduct. That would get used for the rest of the second series in various episodes. It's just that popular and really catchy. and has become one of the most iconic tunes in the TV series. And it's also the final episode of the second series to be based on a story from More About Thomas the Tank Engine. But it wouldn't be the last episode to be based on a story by Christopher Awdry. That would come later on in the series. The episode also has Thomas at his most pratty-ish, since he has no interest in the big engines' excuses for being late and is just more concerned with getting his job done on time. It's especially exemplified with this moment.
Why should I keep my passengers waiting while Henry and James dawdle about all day on viaducts? Don't blame me, snorted Henry. If we hurried across the viaduct, it might collapse, and then you'd have no passengers at all. What would you do then? Run my train on time for one thing, retorted Thomas.
What a dick. But as I said, since I've had stuff like this happen to me in my current job in the past, I can honestly relate to Thomas.
It's those mainline engines. They dither about on the viaduct and then blame the Fat Controller's workmen. It's just an excuse for laziness if you ask me.
So better late than never may not be as exciting as a close shave was, but I see it as a breath of fresh air from the previous episode before we get into the next set of episodes. It's a nice episode with a simple story, and that's one of the things that made Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends really popular in my opinion. Simple stories mixed in with exciting and exhilarating stories. It might not be for everyone, but I would definitely recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it for a while. It's a nice quick breather from the previous episode, and it's a bit of build up for the next episode which would have more excitement and more new characters. Check this out if you haven't seen it for a while. It's one of the good ones. Brake Van is the 16th episode of the second series, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, The Twin Engines. This has become one of my favourite episodes of the TV series throughout the years, and it was the introduction to the famous Scottish twins Donald and Douglas. A set of black twin engines named Donald and Douglas have arrived from Scotland to work on the railway. However, the Fat Controller had only expected one engine. He gives the two engines numbers, Donald 9 and Douglas 10, but still in plans to send one of the two engines back to Scotland. A brake van in the yard takes a disliking to Douglas and causes trouble whenever he has to take him out, making his trains late and causing Douglas to worry. Donald is angry at the brake van for treating his twin in such a cruel manner and bumps him violently, threatening him with more to come if he continues to misbehave. The van starts to behave better afterwards. One day, however, Donald loses control while reversing onto some slippery rails and accidentally crashes tender first into a signal box. The Fat Controller was quite disappointed and speaks severely to Donald, as he had intended to keep him and send Douglas back home. Now Donald will need to have his tender mended and James will have to do his work, which the Fat Controller knows he will not like. The Fat Controller was proven right. James is very angry about the extra work and grumbles dreadfully. Douglas teases James and mentions his accident with the tar wagons, worsening his bad mood. He takes a train of trucks, including the spiteful brake van, who decides to make work difficult for James and has the trucks hold back, quickly tiring James out. Meeting Douglas at Wellsworth, James asks for his assistance in climbing up Gordon's Hill and Douglas agrees. Two engines work as hard as they can, but James starts losing steam while halfway up the hill. Because of this and the weight of the trucks holding back, Douglas accidentally crushes the van into pieces while pushing from behind. The Fat Controller arrives on Edward, who comes with the breakdown train to help clear the mess and is cross that Douglas has also caused this. Edward stands up for Douglas, having heard what happened from his yard, and tells the Fat Controller of all the hard work Douglas did. Although the Fat Controller understands that Douglas was only trying to help, he does think that Douglas got carried away by destroying the brake van. The Fat Controller then turns and walks away, apparently making up his mind about something. But that's another story. As we all know, the missing coach was intended to be the first part of this storyline. They just decided to take the episode's opening exposition from the stories Hello Twins and the Missing Coach. So you could say that this is a combination of 3 stories rather than 2. With Hello Twins and Brake Van taking more centre stage than the Missing Coach did. The episode is also our introduction to the famous Scottish twins themselves, Donald and Douglas. They are practical, peppery, proud and level-minded, but despite their maturity, they enjoy playing practical jokes and have been known to impersonate one another in the past. They were later on fitted with nameplates to specifically end this element of their humour. Donald and Douglas are very able workers, strong performers, and handle any task well. They are fully capable of being firm with the other big engines such as Gordon and Henry, and even the Troublesome trucks know better than to try their tricks with them. The Scottish twins hate to be parted with each other, but like most twins, they occasionally have their arguments among themselves and can squabble with one another. They also used to have a strong dislike for diesels. But with what was going on in British railways during the time this story was written, I can't say I blame them. And they became fan favourites among many characters in the TV series. And even though it's not exactly the best Scottish impression I've ever heard, Sir Ringo Starr really does try to make an effort to make a Scottish accent for the Scottish twins.
You're a muckle nuisance, said Donald. It's to leave you behind I'd be wanting. You can't, said the van. I'm essential. Oh, Kaya, Donald burst out. You're nothing but a screeching and a noise when all's said and done. Spite Dougie, would you? Take that!
We of course know that the late Michelangelos would do a better Scottish accent in the third series onwards, but even though Ringo Starr didn't exactly do a great one, I give him credit for at least trying. We also get a one-off character in the story in the spiteful brake van, who takes an instant dislike to Douglas and purposely delays his trains, with Douglas being the one blamed for everything. But Donald was able to keep him in line by bumping him fiercely and threatening to do it again if he keeps misbehaving. So Donald was the only one that could keep the brake van in line until he had his accident, and then he started to target James. Like the Troublesome trucks, and as his name implies, the spiteful brake van was spiteful, very rude, disrespectful and incredibly impolite to the engines, especially the Scottish twins. And he's the first character in the TV series to literally be killed off by the end of the episode. So when Douglas is trying to help James up the hill, James loses steam, and Douglas pushing with all his might, combined with the trucks holding back, results in the brake van being crushed in between Douglas and the trucks. And the creators had the balls to show this character's death on screen. That means he's passed on. This brake van is no more. He has ceased to be. He's expired and gone to see his maker. This is a late brake van. He's a stiff, bereft of life. He rests in pieces. If they hadn't used his remains for kindling, he would be pushing up the daisies. He's run down the curtain and joined the choir invisible. This is an ex-brake van. But all joking aside, it was really ballsy of the TV series to follow through with this on-screen death. And we even get to see the corpse's face near the end of the episode, with a black eye. This just shows that David Minton and Britt Allcroft had balls to keep this in. And Donald and Douglas's theme is another highlight of the episode. It just sounds so Scottish that you really feel like you're in Scotland when you listen to it. Just shows you how authentic Mike and Junior were with their themes, going so far as to create a Scottish theme for the Scottish twins. The episode once again brings in continuity from the first series, where Douglas reminds James about his tar wagon accident.
I heard tell about an engine and some tar wagons. Shut up, said James. It's not funny. He didn't like to be reminded of his own accident.
It not only reminds us of a famous accident from the first series, but it also reminds us of how much James hates to be reminded of his incidents, like the bootlaces and the tar wagons. It's another great piece of continuity in the TV series. And if you've watched the episode on the DVD, then you'll notice that Douglas's nameplate is visible when he was pushing the trucks up the hill with James, whereas in the original televised version and the VHS versions, the nameplate isn't seen. And that's because the TV series did a job at censoring out that nameplate, and whenever they couldn't censor it, they did their best to crop the screen so that we couldn't see it properly. And then Hit Entertainment had to go and spoil it all by remastering it and revealing the nameplate, which shows that the team already had the nameplates built during this episode's production, which I suppose did save them from making them later on, but it was kind of silly that they left them on in this particular scene. But they were clever enough to censor it out until Hit Entertainment uncensored it. But aside from that little nitpick, Brake Van has become one of my favourite episodes throughout the years. being one that I would rewatch multiple times when I put the DVD on, as I really love the spiteful Brakevan as a one-off character, so much so that I actually got the Bachman model of him for when I finish my Railway set in the future. I feel that Brakevan is a great introduction to Donald and Douglas the Scottish twins. It's a well-adapted story, it's got great new characters and a great villain. This is an episode I would definitely recommend checking out if you're a fan of Donald and Douglas and if you love the Troublesome Trucks related story and the spiteful Brakevan. But what's to become of the Scottish twins after all this? Well, we'll find out all the answers tomorrow. Stay tuned. The Deputation is the 17th episode of the second series, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, The Twin Engines. This is part 2, as well as the conclusion to Donald and Douglas's story arc in the second series. But is it a satisfying conclusion to the story? Let's take a look. Snow has fallen on the island of Sodor, and while most of the engines, especially Thomas, hate it, Donald and Douglas are used to these conditions and do a good job of clearing the lines. They soon encounter one snowdrift which is deeper than the rest and hear a whistle. It turns out to be Henry, who is nearly buried. The twins promise to get him out. Henry is rescued and soon returns to the shed, but both Donald and Douglas are upset. The Fat Controller will be returning soon, and after their previous mistakes, they're worried that he will send them both back to Scotland. The other engines agree that Donald and Douglas both deserve to stay and that something has to be done, but no one knows what. Percy talks to Edward, who suggests that the engines nominate someone to be a deputation and talk to the Fat Controller. The engines agree to this, even though they don't really know what a deputation is, and Gordon nominates Percy to do the job, much to his horror. The Fat Controller returns and a nervous Percy stammers through his speech about allowing the twins to stay, saying that they are likely to be scrapped if they go back to Scotland. Even though Percy is nervous, Sir Topham Hatt understands this and sends Percy away. Later at the sheds, the Fat Controller responds to the engine's request. He begins by telling them that although he understands their feelings, he does not appreciate them interfering with his plans. He then surprises everyone by giving Donald and Douglas new coats of paint as a reward for their good work in the snow, and announces that their names will be painted on them so as to avoid any further mistakes. The engines realise that the Fat Controller is allowing both of them to stay and drown out the rest of his speech with cheers and happy whistles. The Deputation is the first winter snow-themed episode for the second series, and it's another one that I really enjoy watching every time I put the DVD on, especially around Christmas time. Because as I mentioned before, I love the snow, and the snow-themed episodes for Thomas and Friends is usually the best ones in my opinion. It just brings back a lot of childhood memories of me playing in the snow. And I love the way Gordon and James briefly recap what happened to Donald and Douglas in the previous episode.
A lot of nonsense about a broken signal box, grumbled Gordon. That spiteful Brakevan too, put in James. Good riddance, that's what I say.
Like Duck's recap of Dirty Work, it's short, sweet and straight to the point. And it's super hilarious the many ways the engines say deputation wrongly. I don't know if anyone's done it yet on YouTube, but you can make a combination video of every time they say the word wrong.
Devastation, desperation, disputation, desperation. The Fat Controller pondered. Do you mean a deputation?
Classic stuff. And we once again get a great panning shot of the engines thinking of who to nominate to be the deputation. I love how there's a huge silence in that, just giving us time to watch the engines' thinking faces and to hear Michael Donald Jr. Campbell's great music. It's something that they didn't really have to do in the episode, but they did it anyway, just to let us appreciate the panning shots that they could do at the time, as well as appreciating Mike and Junior's music. It's just elements like this that make the TV series worthwhile. I also really adore how nervous Percy is when he's trying to speak to the Fat Controller about Donald and Douglas's predicament. It's just an adorable Percy moment in my opinion. And rewatching this episode, I've realised that the episode may have been filmed alongside Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree. Since the shot of Percy talking to the Fat Controller, you can see some Christmas decorations at Tidmouth Station. So it's very likely that they filmed both episodes at the same time, so they don't have to worry about cleaning up the snow twice. When you look back at it, it does make sense that they would do that. And the factor of Donald and Douglas being used to the snow and doing good jobs at clearing the line was something that would carry on throughout the TV series. It would even go as far as the CGI series when the characters were brought back. It's just another element of the show that's been continued throughout the years. You know, every time Donald and Douglas actually appeared in the TV series. I think it's the little boy within me, but every time I rewatch this episode nowadays, I get a little teary-eyed when I see the ending. It's just such a happy ending after all that Donald and Douglas have gone through in the past episode. And even though I've seen it multiple times, especially rewatching it just for the review series this year, I still get a little teary-eyed when I see the engines whistle and cheer in excitement that the twins are staying. It just has a great effect on me. In my opinion, the Deputation is a wholesome conclusion to Donald and Douglas' story arc in this series. And it's one of the best snow-related episodes in the TV series as well, in my opinion, coming from a guy who loves snow and snow-related episodes for Thomas. This is another episode I would recommend for all Thomas fans out there who haven't seen it for a while. But like with the Duck and the Diesel saga, I'd say start with Breakfan and then make your way to the Deputation. It's two episodes that should be seen back to back in one glorious lineup. It's another one of those episodes that can be rewatched any time of the year, but you'll definitely get a Christmassy feeling if you watch it around the winter. It's a great conclusion to Donald and Douglas' story, and it has one of the happiest endings you'll ever see in the TV series. Check it out if you haven't seen it for a while. It's worth your time.
But the rest of his speech was drowned in a delighted chorus of cheers and whistles. The twins were here to stay.
Thomas Comes to Breakfast is the 18th episode of the second series and is based on the story of the same name from the Runaway series book, Branchline Engines. This is the first episode of Series 2 since Better Late Than Never to be centred around Thomas, since the previous two took a break from him to focus on Donald and Douglas. Thomas has spent many years running this branch line. One day, when his driver jokes that Thomas could manage without him, Thomas takes the jokes literally and becomes conceited. He later brags to Percy and Toby that he does not need a driver. They both disagree with this, as they would never ever consider running without their drivers, but Thomas insists that he's not afraid to run by himself and willing to prove it. The next morning, the firelighter comes and starts up the engine's fires. Thomas wakes up first with the warmth spreading through his boiler. When he sees Percy and Toby are still asleep, he decides to take the opportunity to run by himself to prove them wrong, unaware that he only started due to a careless cleaner accidentally touching his controls. He finds out his mistake as he tries in vain to stop or wheesh as he planned. Sitting at the end of the siding ahead is a nearby station master's house, where he and his family are having breakfast. Unable to stop, Thomas runs right through the fence and hedges and crashes into the front of the house, creating disarray in the dining room with plaster covering everything. The station master glares at a stunned Thomas, whom his wife scolds for ruining their breakfast.
"You miserable engine," she scolded. "Just look what you've done to our breakfast. Now I shall have to cook some more."
She then storms out of the dining room, slamming the door, causing more plaster to fall and cover Thomas. After workmen prop up the house with poles, Donald and Douglas arrive, and together they pull Thomas clear of the house and back onto the rails, revealing his front to be battered and bent from the impact, with a bush and pieces of broken wood stuck to it. Back at the sheds, the Fat Controller scolds the battered tank engine for his recklessness and informs him that he has been sent to the works to be mended, which will take a long time, and in his absence a diesel railcar will be brought in to run his branch line. Thomas is shocked at hearing this, and the Fat Controller then concludes,
"Diesels always stay in their sheds till they are wanted. Diesels never gallivant off to breakfast in station masters' houses."
This episode marks the second time in the second series where an engine crashes into someone's estate, with the first one being Duck in a close shave, and the station master's wife's reaction to the whole thing is still hilarious to this day.
"You miserable engine," she scolded. "Just look what you've done to our breakfast. Now I shall have to cook some more.
It's just incredibly hilarious how more concerned she is about the breakfast than the giant hole in the wall. Not to mention the fact that Thomas was like this close to running over everyone at the table. But then again, if she did make a British fire, then that would be understandable. Because that's a pretty big deal, isn't it? And Sir Ringo Starr's delivery of that line is super hilarious today. I love how his voice cracks a little bit when she's saying the line.
Look what you've done to our breakfast.
And it became so popular that it turned into a song using the theme tune for the TV series on YouTube.
Look what you've done to our breakfast. Look what you've done. Look what you've done to our breakfast.
And it's one of the most iconic episodes in the TV series as well, having tons of merchandise based on it, including Wooden Railway, as well as re-releases of the story on books. It also even got recreated in the movie Big World Big Adventures, for the musical number Where in the World is Thomas. The episode also includes another unintentional scare, as we get a close-up of Thomas running on his own and looking super worried. I know this wasn't intended to scare anyone, but it somehow just did. It's probably because of how the camera was positioned in the scene. I mean, it literally looks like you're looking up at an engine that's coming right towards you. So looking back at it, you can see how this might scare some kids. And even some older fans of Thomas as well. Though one thing that might rub people the wrong way for this episode is the fact that Thomas gets a scolding for the accident instead of the careless cleaner that touched his controls. Because you can't really blame Thomas for running off on his own, because he needs a driver and fireman to control him. So if anything, the careless cleaner who touched his controls should have been told off. Now this is a little factor that quite a few fans on YouTube have pointed out, including Northwestern Railway Tales. It's just something that brought fans together to make a little amends for it. Also, when you look at this scene of Percy talking to Thomas about his idea of going off on his own, have you ever noticed that looks like Donald's tender and that signal box in the background? Well, that was due to the fact that Break Van as well as Thomas Comes to Breakfast were filmed in the same slot, so they accidentally left Donald crashed into the signal box in this scene. But if you haven't looked at it from the behind the scenes perspective, you could make the argument that the episodes took place during the same time. Nice. Despite that, you can't deny that Thomas Comes to Breakfast has become one of the most iconic episodes of the TV series. It's got one of the most iconic crashes, and it has one of the funniest deliveries you'll ever hear Ringo Starr do. It's an episode that's definitely worth checking out if you haven't seen it for a while, and we'll get to see this new diesel railcar in action in the next episode. But until tomorrow, I'm just going to wrap up this review with the Look What You've Done to Our Breakfast song.
Look what you've done to our breakfast. Look what you've done. Look what you've done to our breakfast. To our breakfast. Now I shall have to cook some more. Look what you've done. Look what you've done to our. Look what you've done breakfast. Look what you've done breakfast.
Taking place after the events of Thomas Comes to Breakfast is the 19th episode of the second series, Daisy, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, The Branch Line Engines. This episode is our introduction to Daisy the Diesel Railcar, who over the years has become one of the most iconic characters in the series. But how does her introduction episode hold up? Percy and Toby arrive at the station feeling worried for Thomas after he had been sent to be repaired following his recent accident. The Fat Controller waits for them in order to introduce Daisy, the diesel railcar, who will help run the branch line while Thomas is away. Percy asks if she will leave after Thomas returns, and the Fat Controller responds that it depends on her performance. Regardless, he expects Percy and Toby to welcome her and help her settle in. The two engines happily agree, so they start by taking Daisy to the engine shed to rest. Arriving at the engine shed, however, Daisy snobbishly tells Percy and Toby that she thinks the shed is dreadfully smelly, and states that anything smelly is bad for her swerves. This makes Percy and Toby cross, but the two carry on and take her to the carriage shed. Daisy prefers it, but asks what the rubbish is next to her. The rubbish she's referring to is Annie, Clarabelle and Henrietta, all of whom are greatly offended by this and refuse to stay where they're insulted. Percy and Toby are forced to take them out of the shed and stay up half of the night trying to soothe their hurt feelings. Percy and Toby end up feeling exhausted the next morning, while Daisy wakes up feeling full of energy as she goes to the station to take her first set of passengers. Arriving, she starts to show off to woo them. Her attitude, however, changes when she sees Toby coupling a milk tanker to her. Enraged, Daisy refuses to take it and, despite her driver's arguments, violently shudders, lurches backwards and blows a fuse. Everyone at the station argues with her, but to no avail. Daisy explains that her fitter ordered her to never take any trucks because she is highly sprung and pulling is bad for her swerves. No one at the station believes her excuse and start to wonder why the Fat Controller boards an engine with such an attitude to the island. With everyone late now, the crew is left with no choice but to leave the milk tanker behind and allow Daisy to enjoy her journey, taking only the passengers. As she runs, Daisy chuckles to herself at how well her story worked and secretly decides that she will do only the work that she wants to do.
Oh, you should meet my ex-wife! She does the same thing! You two would be perfect for each other!
The episode successfully introduces us to Daisy the Diesel railcar, who is known to consider herself highly sprung and right up to date. She can be hard to please, mostly indignant and highly opinionated. She is extremely authoritative, trustworthy and confident in herself, and can sometimes boast of her abilities in particular situations, unconcerned despite having never actually been in such a position before. She will sometimes presume she can show other engines a thing or two, despite knowing little on the matter, until she actually learns for herself. And she's based off of these famous railcar diesels that were introduced in Britain. It's quite funny because when you see diesel railcars on heritage railways, they normally consist of 2 or 3 coaches, whereas Daisy is the only one, which makes her unique. And even though Sir Ringo Starr doesn't exactly sound like a lady when he's doing her lines, I do admire how he's trying to give her an upper class accent, and how he delivers her lines at the times. It's just hilarious.
This is dreadfully smelly. I'm highly sprung, and anything smelly is bad for my swerves. Look at me, she purred to the passengers. I'm the latest diesel, highly sprung and right up to date. You won't want Thomas's bumpy old Annie and Clarabelle now. Do they expect me to pull that? Surely, said her driver, you can pull one van. I won't, said Daisy. Percy can do it. He loves messing about with trucks. I can't understand, said the shunter. Whatever made the Fat Controller send us such a feeble, spluttered Daisy. Let me!
I also really love how she doesn't get on well with any of the other engines, nor Annie, Clarabelle or Henrietta.
Whatever is that rubbish? The rubbish turned out to be Annie, Clarabelle and Henrietta, who were most offended. We won't stay here to be insulted, they fumed.
And Annie, Clarabelle and Henrietta usually get along with everyone on the island, so it's a nice change of pace to see them meet someone whom they will grow to dislike. And when you first watch this episode, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Daisy is going to be a bad diesel like Devious Diesel, but she's more somewhere in the middle. Someone who does want to please the passengers as well as the Fat Controller, but also has a bad attitude towards things like pulling trucks and sharing the shed with coaches or sleeping in an engine shed, which she considers smelly. So she's sort of somewhere in the middle. Not as bad as Devious Diesel was, but she's no angel either. She's a balance of both. And Daisy's theme tune is just top notch from Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell. It just sounds like something you wouldn't normally hear in Thomas the Tank Engine. But it just suits the character down a treat. And it should be worth pointing out that even though they still say it's a milk van in the episode, like what it was in the book, what we see on screen is actually a milk wagon. Now it's kind of weird that they would make a milk wagon and then still call it a van, but I suppose they probably ran out of money to make an actual milk van, so they just had to use what they already had. But at the same time, it's kind of weird that they wouldn't change the dialogue. Talk about sticking super close to the book. but it's just a minor nitpick and it doesn't come close to ruining this episode. And it's one of those episodes in the TV series where we get to focus mainly on one whole area. And that's the junction where Thomas meets up with the mainline engines before carrying on with his trains. Even the carriage shed and the engine shed take place in the exact same location. I mean, when you look at shots of the station in this episode and episodes that came before this, then you could see the carriage shed and the engine shed in the background in the sidings behind it. I just find it really cool that both sheds will be in the exact same area as this station is. And it's one of those few times, as I said, where we get to focus on one whole area for most of the episode. Because most other episodes you go to various areas. And this is one of the few that sticks to one area. And that's why Daisy is one of the best episodes in the TV series in my opinion. It might not have any runaways, chases or crash scenes, but it's a great way to introduce us to Daisy the diesel rail car. It's another episode that I do recommend checking out if you haven't seen it for a while. Especially if you're a fan of Daisy. Based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, Branchline Engines, the 20th episode of the second series, Percy's Predicament, is the conclusion to the Branchline Engines saga, or perhaps if you want to call it the Daisy trilogy. Daisy's time on the island of Sodor is going well for her, but badly for everyone else. Not only is she frightened of bulls and cows, she remains lazy, bad-tempered and stubborn, refusing to do jobs she does not want to do. Percy grumpily shuts trucks one day as Toby pulls in, noticing that Daisy has once again refused to take the milk tanker. This ends up forcing Percy to make a special trip with it after his usual work is done. Wanting to help, Toby offers to take the milk if Percy fetches his trucks from the quarry in return. Their crews agree to this and Percy sets off. Percy goes to the quarry to fetch the trucks and starts enjoying himself by ordering the trucks about. The trucks do not take kindly to another engine entering the quarry and giving them orders, so they decide to pay Percy out. Once the trucks are arranged and coupled behind Percy, they lure him into a false sense of security by following him so quietly that he thinks they are under control. When Percy sees a sign ordering trains to pin down brakes, he whistles to the guard to apply the brakes, only for the trucks to make their move and push him along down the line, leaving Percy whistling frantically for help. A man on duty at the level crossing rushes out to warn traffic with his red flag, but it's too late to switch Percy to the runaway siding.
Whoops.
This leads to Percy swerving into the goods yards and crashing into a brake van, destroying it and perching himself on top of the remains of a truck. His driver and fireman have managed to jump clear, but Percy is left stranded.
Oh man, Simmons, I feel bad. But you must feel way worse, because you fucking suck. This was entirely your fault.
The next day, Toby and Daisy arrive to help clear the mess. The Fat Controller arrives too and is cross as he speaks to Percy. The branch line will now have to run with just Toby and the Diesel, putting them in an awkward predicament. Percy, very much stuck in his own predicament, understands fully what he means and feels sorry. The Fat Controller then tells Percy that he is going to be left where he is until everything else is cleared up, hoping that the weight will teach him to be more careful with trucks in the future. The Fat Controller then turns to Daisy and tells her off for her laziness, declaring that his engines work hard, while he sends lazy ones like her away. Daisy is left feeling ashamed of herself, but the Fat Controller decides to give her another chance, given how hard she worked after Percy's accident. Daisy is grateful and promises to work hard with Toby's help. Knowing Toby has a lot of experience of running a branch line, the Fat Controller is satisfied. The next day, Thomas returns from the works, fully mended and feeling much better. Being happily reunited with Annie and Clarabelle, he takes them for a run while Percy is sent to the works to be repaired himself. All the engines are now friends and Daisy learns a lot from Toby, leading to her becoming a really useful engine. She even manages to shoo a stray cow off the line unassisted. As I said, this was the final part of the Branchline Engines trilogy, and it does satisfy with its delivery in my opinion. Although one thing that might rub people the wrong way with this episode is the fact that they didn't have that bullseye yet. For some reason that episode wouldn't be adapted until the 4th series, but they did hint to the fact that Daisy is frightened of bulls and cows, nonetheless. And we would get the story eventually, we just had to wait a couple of years for it. But I still think it holds up without the inclusion of Bullseye. Either the team didn't consider including this story in it because they already had enough stories to adapt as it was, or perhaps they just wanted to save it for a later series. I don't really know how the story went, but it could have been either one of those. Also, am I the only one who finds it really funny that they say that Percy has never been to the quarry before when he was clearly at this exact quarry in Percy and Harold? And I get they were sticking to the original source material, but it just feels weird that they would still include this line when he was obviously at the same quarry in Percy and Harold. I haven't really read them for a while, but maybe in the books they use different quarries for both stories, but it just feels weird using that line when he's been to that exact same quarry 20 episodes ago. But you can't really complain, it's still a well-redacted episode in my opinion. And an interesting bit of trivia for you guys, the small truck that's in the quarry before Percy sets off to pull other trucks to the yards is actually wearing the spiteful Brakevan's angry face. I guess they just decided it would be cool to use that face on a truck. And it honestly really does fit this truck, as the standard truck faces would have been too big for that little truck, so they had to use something that they already had, and the spiteful Brakevan's angry face just happened to be the perfect size. And while on the subject of a Brakevan, this is the second time that a Brakevan gets destroyed in this series. The island of Sodor really does have a habit of destroying Brakevans in this series, doesn't it? I love how near the end the Fat Controller is completely stern with Daisy for being such a lazy engine in the previous episode, but is willing to give her a second chance given the circumstances.
My engines work hard. I send lazy engines away. Daisy was ashamed. However, Toby says you worked hard after Percy's accident, so you shall have another chance. Thank you, sir, said Daisy. I will work hard, sir. Toby says he'll help me. Excellent. What Toby doesn't know about branch line problems isn't worth knowing. Our Toby's an experienced engine.
It's another fine example of how the Fat Controller is firm but fair. And it's Percy's second big crash in the series. Him running into that brake van, destroying it and perching on top of a truck is just an awesome image. It's one of those images that could scare little kids, but it's amazing to watch when you watch it years later. It really shows how far the team have come since the first series, being able to pull off a crash scene so effortlessly. The episode also shows us another side to the trucks. A side when they don't bump engines and cause them to crash just for the hell of it. Sometimes they do it when an engine they don't know orders them about. It shows that they don't take kindly to being ordered about by an engine they're not familiar with. It's just an element of the show that makes the Troublesome trucks more than just troublesome little rascals that we all know them for. It shows they got some depth and character to them as well. And the Sir Ringo Starr highlight for me in this episode is when he's delivering the truck's lines in the quarry. Mainly the scene when they're planning to pay Percy out. Just his delivery of that chant is just so superb in my opinion.
The trucks rumbled to each other. This is Toby's place. Percy's got no right to poke his funnel up here and push us around. They whispered and passed the word. Hey, Percy out! Hey, Percy out!
Definitely one of his best deliveries.
Come along, Puff Percy. No nonsense. We'll give him nonsense, giggled the trucks.
So Percy's Predicament is a great way to finish off the branch line engine saga in my opinion. It's got great sets, a cool runaway scene, an awesome as hell crash scene, and it just has a great moral to it about learning to be careful and to not be lazy or stubborn when doing jobs. It's an episode that I would definitely recommend checking out if you haven't seen it for a while. It's got a great crash scene, and it's a great way to end Daisy's storyline for the second series. And there'll be more new characters to come in the next episode, so stay tuned for tomorrow. The Diseasel is the 21st episode of the second series. It's based on the story of the same name from the Runaway series book Mainline Engines, and it introduces us to Bill and Ben the Tank Engine twins and Boko the Diesel, three other fan favourites among the Thomas community. Bill and Ben are tank engine twins who each have 4 wheels, a small funnel, a tiny chimney and small cab. They work at a China clay quarry and their job is to take it in trucks along the main line for engines and ships. The clay is used to make many things like pottery, paper and paint for example. One morning the twins arrange some trucks and leave to pick up more, but they are surprised to find they have disappeared when they return. Their drivers notice a patch of oil on the tracks and suspect that a diesel is responsible for taking the trucks. This hearing this has Diseasel. The twins remember a notice in their shed saying coughs and sneezes spread diseasels, and they argue over who is responsible. The drivers intervene and make a plan to get the trucks back, which involves removing the twins' nameplates and making them identical, as the diesel is unaware that they are twins. The twins find the trucks in a yard with a large green diesel in front. Ben hides behind, with Bill going forward to demand the trucks back. The diesel claims the trucks are his and tries to shoo Bill away, but Bill reverses behind the trucks and Ben rides forward, surprising the diesel, thinking it is the same engine. This goes on for a while, causing the diesel to get dizzy. The twins then reveal themselves to him. Edward arrives at the scene and asks what Bill and Ben are doing. They claim that the diesel stole their trucks, but Edward scolds them for their rudeness. The twins apologise and the diesel forgives them. He introduces himself as Boko and explains that he got his trucks mixed up with the twins'. Edward then sends the twins to take their lot back once they pick up Boko's trucks in exchange for theirs. After they leave, Edward tells Boko that they do not mean any harm, but they can be maddening at times. A statement Boko wholeheartedly agrees with. The episode manages to introduce us to 3 new characters rather than just 1 or 2 this time around. Starting with Bill and Ben, the yellow-saddled tank engine twins belonging to the Sodor China Clay Company. They are Sodor's most mischievous tank engines, who have great fun in teasing and playing jokes on other engines on the railway. They enjoy attention and love taking visitors and being photographed. They tend to work together, like most twins, but even this youthful pair can have their arguments among themselves and can squabble with one another, particularly about whose fault one of their follies was.
You had a cough in your smoke box yesterday. It's your fault the Diseasel came. It isn't. It is. Stop arguing, you two.
They are highly prone to playing tricks and being cheeky. There is no real harm in them, but even Edward admits that they are maddening at times. Bill appears to be the quicker-witted leader, while Ben seems to be the follower of the pair. Ben and Ben are based on the Bagnall 040 tank engines, Alfred and Judy, who can be seen every now and then on heritage railways and on the main railways. And I even got a glimpse of them crossing underneath the Coronation Bridge in Bristol. Even though I can't really remember when my photographs are of them, it was quite an amazing sight to see. It was quite awesome to see the real-life Bill and Ben, and it's amazing that the 2 are still preserved to this day. And we get our 3rd diesel for the series, Boko, a Greenwich traffic engine diesel, who primarily works on Edward's branch line and occasionally the main line. He is a tame diesel engine who is sensible, kind, and has a decent sense of humour. He is also very disciplined, as seen as he stops Bill and Ben from their pranks. Upon his arrival, he was unfortunate enough to be set upon by the mischievous Bill and Ben when they pretend to be one engine and nearly make his eyes pop out. Boko is now wise to the tank engine twins' pranks, though he still somewhat humours them to a point. He is also good friends with Bill, Ben, Edward and Doug. He is a true friend and is often willing to stick up for the underdog. Boko is firm but fair and friendly in his nature, not afraid to speak his mind. And this character is based off of the British Rail Class 28 Cobalt diesel electric trains. And I don't know for myself because I haven't seen them in real life, but I'm pretty sure that all of these diesels were scrapped, as I have seen none of them on any heritage lines. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I just don't think there are any left in the world. And like with Daisy, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Boko was going to be a bad diesel just like Devious Diesel was, since the diesel engines on Sodor didn't exactly have a good record when they arrived at first. Whereas Diesel was the bad diesel, Daisy was somewhere in the middle between good and bad, and Boko was the good one at heart. He was the first friendly diesel to arrive on the island, and that makes him one of a kind at this point. Obviously we would be introduced to more friendly diesels as the show went on, but Boko was the first, and that makes him special in most Thomas fans' hearts. And one goof that sticks out to everybody's mind in this episode is the fact that when the twins' driver says that they'll take away the engine's names and numbers, even though Bill and Ben don't actually have numbers in the TV series, whereas they did in the original Railway series. Although it was shown in some behind the scenes pictures that Bill and Ben were intended to have their numbers painted on them, but for some reason it was dropped at the last minute, and yet they still kept the original line how it was in the TV episode. This is an episode that sticks in my mind a lot when rewatching Thomas the Tank Engine, because it was one of the many episodes that I used to watch multiple times over and over again on VHS tapes, and I still rewatch a ton of times on the DVD. I guess it was because it was my introduction to Bill and Ben and I loved their mischievousness. They're two of my favourite characters in the TV series, especially with how they pronounce Diesel wrong, as well as doing the mitts on the whole coughs and sneezes spread diseases line.
Coughs and sneezels spread diseasel.
That's just stuck with me and my parents for so many years that we actually do say it in the exact same way Bill and Ben did. It's just one of those things that stuck with us and never left us. And once again, Ringo Starr gives a superb performance for this episode, especially when he does Bill, Ben and Boko's voices. I especially love Bill and Boko's first interaction with each other. The way Ringo delivers his lines are just flawless to me.
The Diesel looked up. Do you mind? Yes, said Bill, I do. I want my trucks, please. These are mine, said the Diesel. Go away. Bill pretended to be frightened. You're a big bully, he whimpered. You'll be sorry.
Another one of his best performances in my opinion. And I love how it shows how Edward is the only engine on Sodor who could keep Bill and Ben in order, since it's been implied that other engines don't really get on well with Bill and Ben and aren't used to their pranks, whereas Edward is most likely used to them and knows how to keep them in line. That's just another bit of great character development for Edward. And that scene when Bill and Ben are playing their trick on Boko, making him believe that it's just one engine somehow switching the same tracks, is still one of the most hilarious and iconic moments for the TV series for me. I especially love that hilariously fast-paced little ditty that Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell composed for the scene. It just sounds so bouncy and fun that I can't help to hum into it and dance into it every now and then. It's just one of those many tunes from Mike and Junior that doesn't seem to get as much attention as most of the others do, but over time it's gotten more recognised throughout the years, and it makes it one of their most iconic tunes in my opinion. And all this is why the Diseasel has always been one of my favourite episodes for Series 2, and always will be. If you haven't seen this episode for a while, check it out for yourselves and see what you've been missing out on. You'll be introduced to Bill, Ben and Boko, you'll get a lot of great laughs out of this episode, and it's just all around entertaining to watch. It's easily among one of the best. On Road is the 22nd episode of the second series and is based on the story of the same name from the Runaway series book, Mainline Engines. This is another one of those episodes in the TV series that I would rewatch multiple times whenever I put the VHS tapes on and the DVD on. It's just one of those episodes that somehow left an impact on me. Well, let's go through the story before I go into details. Thomas and Edward's branch lines are very important to the railway. However, their track and bridges are not as strong as those on the main line, so the Fat Controller does not allow larger engines like Henry and Gordon, for example, to run on them. Although this is purely for safety, Gordon believes the rule is for another reason entirely. One day he complains to Edward about the Fat Controller letting Boko pull mainline trains despite him being a branch line diesel. Edward jokingly suggests that Gordon ask if he could take Boko's trucks in return, but Gordon refuses to consider it. Edward notes that it might be a nice change, but Gordon claims the Fat Controller would never agree and states that branch lines are vulgar before snorting off, followed by an amused Edward. Every evening, both Gordon and Edward take late-night trains from Knapford. Gordon takes the mainline express at 6:25, Edward then leaves 5 minutes later with his train for the branch line. Normally everything runs fine, but that evening there's trouble. A lady wearing a green floppy beach hat is on the platform, saying goodbye to a friend in the guard's van when it's nearly time for Gordon to start. Looking back, Gordon's fireman, who is new to the job, sees what he thinks is the guard waving a green flag, but it's actually just the lady's hat moving. Gordon leaves with the majority of his passengers, their luggage, and the guard stranded on the platform as a result. Everyone is surprised and mostly cross. Gordon is soon stopped and brought back, feeling humiliated. By now Edward is late, so he sets off first instead. This causes more trouble, however, since no one informed the Junction Shinderman about the plan changing, and Edward is accidentally sent down the main line. When Gordon follows, he is sent down the branch and ends the evening being forced to sleep in a siding at the harbour. The next morning, Bill and Ben arrive to pick up their trucks from Boko in the yard. While neither Boko nor the trucks are there, they do not mind, as they much prefer the idea of teasing Gordon. After joking that the large blue engine near them cannot be Gordon, as Gordon would never go on branch lines and he thinks them vulgar, they jokingly conclude that it's a pile of old iron. Bill considers taking the old iron to the scrapyard, while Ben suggests throwing it into the sea. Gordon, unaware of the twins' joking nature, starts to panic and begs Boko to save him when the Diesel arrives with some trucks. Boko soon realises what is happening and sends the twins off by threatening to take the trucks he brought for them away. They quickly run off as a relieved Gordon thanks Boko. Not knowing the twins were only teasing, Gordon ends up thinking that Boko saved his life. As I mentioned, this is an episode that I used to re-watch multiple times whenever I had it on VHS tape, and I still re-watch it multiple times whenever I put the DVD on. It's just one of those episodes that stuck to me a lot when I was a kid. I think it had something to do with the plot and the funny moments, like when Bill and Ben teased Gordon.
Teasing Gordon would be much better fun. What's that? Asked Bill. Shh, whispered Ben. It's Gordon. It looks like Gordon, but it can't be. Gordon never comes on the branch lines. He thinks them vulgar. Gordon pretended he hadn't heard them. If it isn't Gordon, said Ben, it's just a pile of old iron, which we'd better take to the scrapyard. No, Bill, this lot's useless for scrap. We'll take it to the harbour and dump it in the sea. Gordon was alarmed. I am Gordon. Stop, stop!
That part just gets me every time. I also love how extremely pompous Gordon has been throughout the beginning of the episode on his views of branch lines. Unlike the whole of Series 2, Sir Ringo Starr really does give it his all with his performance in this episode, especially when he has to voice Gordon. The best Sir Ringo Starr performance for this episode to me is when Gordon's chatted to Edward about branch lines and Boko.
It's not fair, grumbled Gordon. What isn't fair? Asked Edward. Letting branch line diesels pull main line trains. Never mind, Gordon. I'm sure Boko will let you pull his truck sometime. Gordon spluttered. I won't pull Boko's dirty trucks. I won't run on branch lines. Why not? Would be a nice change. The Fat Controller would never approve, puffed Gordon. Branch lines are vulgar.
Another top-notch performance in my opinion. And the moment where Gordon begs Boko for help when the twins tease about him being dumped in the sea.
Boko, my dear engine, save me.
I know it's supposed to be Gordon begging, but because of the way Ringo Starr delivers that line, I can't help but chuckle at the way he does it. It just sounds super hilarious. I also find it super hilarious how all their troubles throughout the episode is all started by a lady wearing a green floppy hat, which the fireman mistakes for a guard's flag. That part just always stuck to me as a kid. So much so that I ended up adapting this story for my Thomas series, if you remember. I just love it that much. It's also one of the more visually stunning episodes of Series 2. All of Series 2 we get a lot of stunning shots on the railway work life, and this episode is no exception. We get beautiful shots of the Watermill Bridge on Thomas's branch line, the bridge on Edward's branch line, and a great night view in Knapford Station, as well as that awesome night view of the viaduct. It's just an episode that's visually stunning to watch, and it did introduce us to the Watermill theme, which has become iconic over the years. It's a wonderfully cheerful tune that you could put to any landscape picture and just enjoy listening to it while enjoying the sceneries. It's such a great tune. It might not have any runaway scenes or chase scenes or big exciting plots as previous episodes had, but it's another one of those episodes that I can watch multiple times and never get tired of. It just had that long-lasting effect on me, and that just seems to happen with some episodes in the series. Usually the more exciting episodes with runaways, chase scenes and crash scenes and new characters are usually the ones that stick with you. But sometimes the simple episodes where not a lot happens can stick with you too for one reason or another. And this one is because of the funny as hell moments and how Gordon takes centre stage. And of course Sir Ringo Starr's top-notch performance. It's an episode that I can rewatch multiple times and never get tired of, and I highly recommend you check it out as well if you haven't for a while. It's a fun episode starring Gordon, Edward, Bill, Ben and Boko. It's got one of the funniest plot lines in the TV series, and it's one that you can watch multiple times and never get tired of if you love some simple plots. Take a Von road of your own and join Gordon the Big Engine's hijinks. Here's another really popular one, guys. The 23rd episode of the second series, based on the story of the same name from the Runaway series book, Mainline Engines, Edward's Exploit. This episode has gained quite a following recently. It's become one of the most talked about and iconic episodes of the TV series in most recent years. So what is it about this episode that makes people remember it so much? Let's dive into the story before we go into all that. Bertie has been giving several visitors a tour across the island of Sodor, and on their last afternoon, Edward prepares to take them to visit Bill and Ben, but has trouble starting due to the packed coaches and is made fun of by Henry and James for how much he is struggling, while Gordon grumbles that it is time for Edward to retire. Duck and Boko take exception to this and defend him, telling the Big Engines that Edward is superior to all of them, knowing that Edward is capable of far more than he seems. Finally, Edward manages to start and leaves the station. When he arrives at the junction, the passengers meet Bill and Ben, who enjoy the attention and having pictures taken. The passengers then board the twins' brake vans and travel to the China Clay Works. The visitors have a wonderful day, being very impressed with the place as well as the twins. Afterwards, the twins with the passengers return to the junction and board Edward's coaches to head home. On the way back, the weather turns bad and begins to rain hard. As Edward fights the elements, his sanding gear fails, which forces his firemen to ride out front on the running board and manually sand the rails by hand. But there is worse to come. Without warning, Edward's wheels suddenly slip fiercely, which leads to something breaking with a shrieking crack and forcing him to stop. Edward's crew examine him and find a broken crank pin, forcing them to remove his side rods. His driver reminds Edward that they must get the visitors back to the station as soon as possible since they must leave tonight. Edward promises to try. Edward tries to start, but his wheels and the slippery rails prevent him from moving. The passengers become anxious, so Edward's crew and the guard make more adjustments. They loosen the couplings between the coaches so that Edward can be able to pick them up one by one as he does with trucks. Edward cautiously makes another attempt to start. This time it works. Edward is forced to go slowly, but keeps steady and finally makes it back to the station where Henry is waiting for him. The Fat Controller angrily points to the clock, but he is swept aside by the cheerful passengers who thank Edward and his crew for all their hard work. Afterwards, Edward wearily returns to the sheds. Duck and Boko make sure Edward is left in peace as Gordon and James remain silent out of respect. I'm trying to think about what I could say about this episode that most other fans, including the Unlucky Tug, have already said. Because everybody's seen this episode and everybody is in love with it. So I'm going to make a good effort to not repeat anything that the Unlucky Tug said, or at least make a little spin on what he's already said in his little editorial video of the episode. This is the episode where Edward really takes the time to shine, and it brings back his mechanical difficulties that he'd been having throughout Series 2. We all knew from Cows onwards that he had worn out parts, but in this episode his problems get worse as it leads to his crankpins breaking. Of course, in the Railway series, he actually did get physically damaged, whereas in the TV series adaptation, there was no damage to him at all and they only remove his side rods. Now, it could be argued that the team didn't really have the budget to make a second Edward model just to break, so they had to use what they already had. But it is a really effective episode. Like Edward's introduction episode in the first series, it really shows that just because you're old, that doesn't mean that you've had it and you should give up. Edward still had some fight in him despite his damage, and even though the odds are stacked against him with the weather and his broken crank pin, he still makes an effort to try and get the train back before the passengers had to leave the island. And that's just one of the great lessons of the episode as well as the TV series as a whole. Determination. Just because something is stacked against you, that doesn't mean that you should give up instantly, and that you should try again until you get it right. Now some other characters in this series, like maybe Gordon and James, would have probably thrown in the towel instantly. Well, James might have tried to carry on since he did so in Troublesome Trucks, but Gordon would obviously give up since he did give up pulling trucks on his own hill. But Edward is not like them and doesn't throw in the towel. He keeps going despite being damaged. Any of the other engines probably would have thrown in the towel and then waited for a backup engine, but Edward just pushed himself to the breaking point just to get the train back on time. He's an engine who never gives up, and that's why he's one of the most important characters in the series. And even when he's trying his best after removing his sidewalls and to go single like an old-fashioned engine, he still can't really do it because of the weight of the coaches and how wet the rails are. But after a few adjustments and with the help of his crew, he struggles on again until he finally manages to get the train moving. And you can feel the excitement in the characters' voices as well as the music, that everything's going to be fine from here on in. It's one of those episodes that has you wondering whether things are going to turn out alright in the end, and then when it does turn out alright in the end, it's all the more great having sat through it. Even if you've watched this episode several times before, it's still one of the best episodes to watch. Because even though you may have seen this episode hundreds of times before, it's still great to re-watch years later. It's an episode that just gets better and better each time I re-watch it. And that's how a well-written episode should be. An episode that you would have seen before and know what's going to happen, but you just want to re-watch it again and again because of how wonderfully written and adapted it is. It's just another one of those episodes that has a long-lasting effect on fans, no matter how many times you watch it. Something that might throw people off this episode is probably the fact that there's no actual rain in the episode, when it's said that wind and rain batters him. But like with Breaking Edward, that would have cost extra money and they had limitations back then for what they could do with the models and the sets. So you can forgive them for not including actual rain in the episode because of their limitations back then. But none of this ruins this fantastic episode for the TV series. And Sir Ringo Starr definitely gets the emotions right in this episode. With his performances, he really gets the feel of the episode's emotions. You really feel what these characters are going through throughout the entire adventure. It just proves to every Thomas fan that Sir Ringo Starr is one of the best narrators of the TV series. I also love that new variant of Edward's theme that plays just before Edward's crankpin breaks. It's sort of a continuation from his full Series 2 theme, but a more danger-filled theme. Like a lot of the danger themes for the TV series, even though nothing's happened yet, you just get the feel whenever you listen to it that something bad is about to happen. It's one of those bits of music that Michael Donner and Junior Campbell composed that really conveys the emotions of the scene. Unlike most of the danger themes that Mike and Junior composed, shit only hits the fan near the very end of the tune, making it all the more dramatic. Edward's Exploit is definitely the best episode of the second series. I'd even go so far as to say that it's the best episode in the series as a whole. This is an episode that I definitely recommend checking out if you're a Edward the Blue Engine fan and a Thomas the Tank Engine fan in general. It's one of the greatest episodes of the TV series ever made about how you should never give up even if the odds are thrown against you. It's definitely worth a watch. It's one of the greats. I find it kind of ironic that I'm reviewing the 24th episode of the second series based on the story of the same name from the Railway series but tramway engines, because it's called Ghost Train, and when you think of ghosts at Christmas time you always associate it with a Christmas carol. I mean, ghosts coming to visit you at Christmas Eve, but enough about that. We're here to talk about arguably one of the greatest episodes of the TV series, as well as the first ghost-themed episode of the show, Ghost Train. Percy tells Thomas and Toby a story of a ghost train that his driver saw the night before. However, Thomas does not believe a word of it and calls Percy a silly little engine. Percy later tells his driver that Thomas did not believe in the ghosts, and the driver explains that it was only a pretend ghost story on television. That evening, Percy is returning to the sheds from the harbour. Despite being dark, Percy knows exactly where he is and enjoys running at night. However, he is unaware that a cart full of lime is stuck on the tracks at the level crossing ahead. While Sam the farmer has gone for help, Percy comes down the line, destroying the cart and is left completely covered in lime. Percy runs to the nearest signal box, where he meets Toby and his driver explains to the signalman what happened. The signalman arranges to sort out the hazard on the line, but suggests Percy be cleaned up, as he looks like a ghost. This gives Percy an idea to scare Thomas and asks not to be cleaned until he plays his trick. Toby agrees to help and sets off. At the sheds, Thomas is being prepared for his evening train when Toby arrives and tells him that Percy was involved in an accident. Thomas is mildly concerned for Percy, but more worried that this will make him late. Toby tells him that the line has been cleared, but that he thinks he saw Percy's ghost saying it was coming to warn them. Thomas is unconcerned and tells Toby not to worry. After this, however, a ghostly voice comes from outside demanding to be let in. Thomas is frightened as the shed doors open and reveal what appears to be Percy's ghost. Thomas pretends not to be terrified, says he is late and quickly runs off to collect Danny and Clarabelle. Even after he has finished his run, he is so scared that he does not return to the shed for the rest of the night. The next morning, Thomas meets Toby at the station. When Toby asks Thomas where he has been, Thomas reveals that he spent the night in the goods shed, claiming he knew Toby would be sad about Percy's demise and did not wish to intrude. As he makes his excuse, Thomas hears Percy's whistle in the distance and runs off. Percy, who is now cleaned up and none the worse for his adventure, arrives, having heard everything. Percy cannot help but feel pleased as Toby remarks that Thomas is acting as if he had seen a ghost. This is the very first ghost-themed episode for the TV series, and it's an ongoing trope that would carry on throughout the TV series. It's also the 50th episode of the TV series that was ever made. Very few people bring that up when they talk about this episode, but I think it's worth bringing up because 50 episodes is quite a milestone for a TV series. And the episode is just oozing with creepy atmosphere. It's a really well done ghost themed episode for a TV series in the 1980s. And that ghost train theme that Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell composed is just so creepy when you re-listen to it. Even though I don't really watch horror movies or slasher movies, this really does sound like something that could have come out of an 80s horror movie. It's just oozing with creepiness and adds to the creepy apples of the episode. And I also think it's a tune that you don't want your kids listening to alone in the dark. And it once again shows off Thomas's prattish side, as he shows very little concern for Percy and is more worried about being late for his train when he hears that Percy's had an accident.
Percy's had an accident, cried Toby. Poor engine, said Thomas. Botheration! That means I'll be late.
What a dick. And that moment when Percy comes to the shed and scares Thomas by reciting the line from the Three Little Pigs with Toby's help, that scared face that Thomas makes used to scare me a lot when I was a kid. Like with Pop Goes to Diesel, it was never to the point where it made me stop watching the episode and not go for it for years, because it's an episode that I really loved. Whenever I watched it on VHS as a kid, I just always used to cover my eyes as soon as Percy started doing his ghostly voice because I knew that face was coming. I think it has something to do with the fact that it's a close-up shot and it comes right in your face, and the fact that it just comes out of nowhere when you least expect it the first time round. But even when you know it's coming after watching it several years later, it still looks really creepy. In fact, I'd probably say that it's almost scarier than Thomas's O-Face from Series 1. Oh, by the way, that makes its final appearance in this episode. So from this episode on, no more O-Face. Rest in peace, O-Face. And it's worth mentioning that when Percy and Toby play their ghostly trick on Thomas, they recite the line from the tale Three Little Pigs.
Hee, hee, hip, 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 hee. Let me in, let me in, wailed Percy. No, no, not by the smoke of my chimney, chim. I'll chuff and I'll puff and I'll break your door in.
I imagine when Disney fans rewatch this episode, the first thing that comes to their mind is the Disney short Three Little Pigs. It's just funny how the TV series as well as the Railway series can put fairy tale references in their stories. It also gives us one of Sir Ringo Starr's best performances in the TV series. He really does sell those spooky moments, and Toby's acting when he's helping Percy with his ghostly trick. It just shows how far Ringo had come throughout the series since the first series of the show. How much oomph and energy he really gave into his performance in this series. And this episode is another testament to that. Rewatching the episode, it seems like one of the most adult episodes of the series. Which is kind of fitting because this was the final book Robert Aldry wrote. It was as if he was following his readers as they were growing up. So the Runaway series technically started growing up along with the people who read them from the start. And this was also the first time we get to see the real creepy atmos of Sodor, especially with that fog machine covering up the fields and Crow's Farm Crossing. And that scene with the viaduct at night and the ghost train puffing through is just an awesome image. And when you see that ghost train for the first time in the opening of the episode when Percy's telling his story to Thomas and Toby, it just looks really creepy the way the sheet on top of the engine just flaps about in the wind, especially when it goes past the watermill and the full moon. It just adds to the creepiness of the story. It really shows how far the TV series team had come at that point, being able to make fog effects and making creepy scenes look really realistic and creepy. It's really amazing to watch years later. And as I said, the ghost train theme just really adds to the creepy atmos of the story. The team really had pushed the limits of what they could do with their model sets, as well as the technology that they had at the time. And I think this is also worth pointing out for this episode. There's a deleted scene where Terence the tractor pulls the cartload of lime, but then has trouble getting it over the crossing. Whereas in the Railway series book, it was a horse that had trouble getting the cart across the crossing. A minor detail, but it is amazing that they were going to give Terence the tractor a cameo in this story. Ghost Train is one of the most iconic episodes of the TV series, as well as being the first ghost-themed episode as well. It's an episode that can be watched any time of the year, but I'm sure a lot of fans would watch it around Halloween time. I know I do, along with a lot of the other classic creepy episodes. It's an episode that I highly would recommend checking out on Halloween and all the year round. You'll enjoy the creepy atmos, the amazing effects and sets that the TV show had to offer in this episode, and it's just a fun episode as well as being spooky. It's definitely worth a watch.
We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Woolly Bear is the 25th episode of the second series, based on the story of the same name for the Railway series book, Tramway Engines. This was the last episode in the second series to be based on a story by Robert Aldry. But does it still hold up? Let's take a look. In summer, long hay grows beside the line and work gangers cut it and rake it into heaps to dry in the sun. Percy then collects the hay in empty trucks and takes them to the station. There, Toby collects the trucks and takes them to the farmers to feed their stock on the hills. One day, Percy arrives at the station and starts to tease Thomas for thinking he was a ghost. Thomas retorts that Percy is a green caterpillar with red stripes, which makes Percy angry. Thomas then reminds Percy that he has been late at the station every afternoon throughout the week. Percy tells Thomas that it's the hay that is making him late, but Thomas is not interested in Percy's excuses, and Percy leaves. Percy grumbles to himself during the afternoon that he is only late by a few minutes, but nevertheless, he and his driver decide to head to the station early after going to the harbour to drop off some trucks. At the harbour, however, there is trouble. A loose crate of treacle hanging over Percy drops and splatters all over him. The workmen at the harbour try to clean him up, but Percy has to leave and is still very sticky when he does. Soon Percy comes to the hill where the hay is laying, and by now it is very windy, which blows the hay up and onto the track. The line climbs here, so Percy's driver advises him to take a run at it. But Percy's wheels keep slipping on the hay and he must wait for the line to be cleared. When he does so, the wind blows some of the hay onto Percy and it clings to his sticky boiler. At the station, Thomas waits impatiently for a very late Percy. Suddenly, all the passengers start laughing when Percy arrives, as he is now completely covered in hay, apologising for his late arrival. Thomas laughs, saying Percy has crawled out of the hay, Percy does not know what Thomas is talking about, but Thomas tells him that seeing him like a hairy caterpillar is worth being late. Percy runs back to the shed, where his driver shows him what he looks like in a mirror. Now Percy knows why everyone was laughing at him, stating that he looks like a woolly bear. He has to be cleaned before Toby arrives, not knowing that Thomas has already told Toby everything. In the end, it does not matter. When Toby and Thomas arrive, Percy is still a long way from being cleaned, causing the two to make jokes about woolly bear caterpillars and other creatures that crawl about in the hay. Percy does not find these jokes very funny at all. This was a nice calmer episode for everyone to watch in the second series after seeing Ghost Train. And it has a really good sequel to it as well, reminding everybody about Percy's ghostly trick that he played on Thomas. And it's nice to see that Thomas still has a little grudge against Percy for doing it, carrying on with the frenemy trope. And even though this story was actually written before Better Late Than Never in the Railway series timeline, they do make a reference to it in this episode for the TV series timeline, with Thomas's timeline, and the fact that Thomas gets really impatient when engines make him late at the junction. And it's one of the funniest episodes of the TV series as well. Seeing Percy covered in treacle and then hay. It's just one of the funnier episodes of the series. I especially love Percy's reaction to seeing himself in the mirror.
His driver showed him what he looked like in a mirror. Bust my buffers! No wonder they all laughed. I'm just like a woolly bear. He said it!
And that moment where the crate of treacle falls onto Percy at the harbour has always been a highlight for me. I just always look forward to seeing it every time I re-watch the episode.
A crate of treacle was upset all over Percy. Whoops.
A bigger part of it is because of that little ditty Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell made for this scene. It's another one of those little ditties that tells you that something bad's going to happen right before it actually happens, without being too dramatic. And that quick shot of Percy looking shocked to shutting his eyes before the impact, it's just so superbly done. It was amazing how they were able to keep the camera in the exact same spot before they changed the face mask. That's just another example of what a great director David Mitton was, making the transition shots look flawless. The one thing that might rub people the wrong way a little bit is the fact that the narrator Sir Ringo Starr says that playing ghosts is a sensible thing compared to talking about woolly bear caterpillars, but I would hardly consider playing ghosts as a sensible thing. But it's a fun little bit of writing that takes us back to the Ghost Train episode. Woolly Bear is another fun episode that I do recommend checking out if you love the fun episodes of the TV series. It's another episode that centres around Percy, has a really funny plotline, and it's a nice little sequel / callback to Ghost Train. It may not have any runaways, chases or crashes, but it's definitely one of the more fun episodes that's worth checking out, especially if you love stories centred around Percy the Small Engine. Unlike when I reviewed Series 1 episode by episode last year, I wanted to keep the episodes in episode number line rather than mixing them up, so you'll be seeing Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree tomorrow. Until then, have a very Merry Christmas, folks. We've come this far, guys. The 26th and final episode of the second series, Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree, based on the book of the same name by Christopher Awdry. Not only was this the final episode for the second series, but it was also the final time that Sir Ringo Starr would narrate for the show. But is it a good finale? Let's have a look. It is December 23rd, the day before Christmas Eve, or as I like to call it, Christmas Eve, and the final preparations are being made for a carol party to be held at Tidmouth. The engines are working hard setting up the decorations. This year the Fat Controller wants the carol party to be extra special. The Fat Controller is waiting very impatiently when Thomas arrives. He tells Thomas that their Christmas tree has come and Thomas has to fetch it while Duck watches over Annie and Clarabelle. Thomas asks the Fat Controller if he and the other engines can sing the carols too, and the Fat Controller promises to think about it. Thomas is very excited and rushes off, collecting the tree safely, but on the way home he ends up stuck in a snowdrift. Thomas knows that he must arrive back in time and whistles for help, but cannot back out of the heavy snow. Suddenly, an avalanche erupts and buries Thomas and the tree. Back at the yards, the engines are waiting for Thomas. His delay begins to make them cross. but they are silenced by the Fat Controller, who tells them that Snow has knocked the telephone lines down and they must assume that Thomas is stranded. Everyone now feels sorry and Donald and Douglas puff away to save him. They soon reach a snowdrift much deeper than the rest. A cry for help is heard and Donald thinks he hears something, but Douglas thinks it may just be the wind. Hearing the cry carefully, they realise that they are at the drift where Thomas is buried. Time passes as the workmen dig through the snow and free him. Thomas's driver and fireman, who had taken shelter at a nearby cottage, join the rescue, and Thomas is freed from the snow. Thomas follows the twins home and they arrive just as night falls. The Fat Controller rewards the engines by granting them permission to sing the carols. The engines happily chuff away to the station. The lights come on and the Fat Controller declares 3 cheers for Thomas and his friends. Harold the helicopter soon joins the party, bringing Father Christmas, much to everyone's joy. As the carols begin, Thomas tells Percy that although getting stuck in the snow was no fun, it was all worth it for the celebration and wishes everyone a Merry Christmas. This was the second Christmas-centered episode of the TV series, and like Series 2 as a whole, I find this one better than Thomas's Christmas Party. Not saying that I hate Thomas's Christmas Party or anything, that was a really good Christmas episode. But like the rest of Series 2, Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree ups it a notch compared to the last series. And if, like me, you were introduced to the Railway series books as well as the books based on the TV series episodes in your childhood as well as the TV series, then you'll know that the book version of this story is extended compared to the TV episode. The book has a lot more going on in it compared to the TV episode, which sticks to the 5-minute format. And because the book is much longer than the TV series version is, then I see no reason why they couldn't have extended the episode to 10 minutes. Much like how they did with Fireman Sam's Christmas special, extending it to 20 minutes compared to the original 10-minute episode runtime. So I see no reason why they couldn't have just extended this episode to be a 10-minute episode so they could fit the whole story in. But that's just a nitpick, and it doesn't come close to ruining this Christmas episode, which is one of my favourites. In fact, I love it so much that I actually made an extended version of this special of my own a few years ago for my Thomas series. Of course, adding in my own humour to it, and taking some inspiration from the extended book version, because I wanted to give the extended book version some more attention at the time. So that just leaves it open for fans to make their own extended versions of this great episode. You know, we could have just taken the long way back. What, and ruined the plot? And as I mentioned, this was the final episode Sir Ringo Starr narrated before he left to pursue his musical career. And like every other episode he's narrated for this series, you could tell how much fun he was having narrating this story and saying all these lines. It was evident that he must have had a really fun time narrating for this TV series. And he would still hold the memory of it dear in his heart, even to this day. Thomas's snowdrift accident is very reminiscent of Thomas Terence in the Snow from Series 1, when Thomas got stuck in the snowdrift and had to be rescued by Terence. But this time it's more serious, since he gets completely buried in this episode. Then Donald and Douglas had to bring workmen round to dig him out. It's actually a lot more serious than it was in Thomas Terence in the Snow, which makes it all the more enduring and exciting compared to the previous Snow episodes. And it's once again nice to see Donald and Douglas be the heroes of the story, like what they were in the Deputation when Henry got stuck in a snowdrift. It's just really nice to see them take centre stage every once in a while. The final shot of the episode, where every single character shows up, is just reminiscent of Thomas's Christmas Party, where we see all the characters that were introduced for Series 1 show up at Tidmouth Sheds. Although one thing that may confuse people is the fact that devious Diesel shows up at the party instead of Daisy, the Diesel rail car. Now this is very confusing because the Fat Controller sent him packing episodes ago, so why would he just show up out of the blue? It was so confusing in fact that a Thomas the Tank Engine fan on Twitter actually edited the pictures so that Daisy would take Diesel's place, which would have been more fitting since Daisy did stay on the railway. But my guess is they must have just forgot about the Daisy model and just wanted to give Diesel's model a last hurrah, much like how they did with Henry's old shape model in Thomas's Christmas Party. Despite being in his new shape, Henry's old shape got one last hurrah in the final scene. And the shot of Thomas running past Duck and Annie and Clarabo at Tidmouth Station is very reminiscent of the shot from The Runaway, when Thomas runs past Duck in the exact same station. It's just a really touching callback to that previous episode that was also written by Christopher. And also, the two really did have a knack for confusing the Scottish twins' faces with Edward's faces, since in this scene one of the twins is wearing Edward's angry face. And I forgot to mention in my review of Saved from Scrap that Edward was wearing one of the twins' worried faces in one scene. It's just funny how they keep putting the wrong faces on the wrong engines at certain points in the TV series. But that's just human error, and you can't really blame them for making that mistake. I mean, sometimes I've even made mistakes in my videos and I don't notice until the last minute. Sometimes I don't even notice until it's too late. So it's just human error, and it happens to the best of us. Like every other snow episode from the TV series, this is just so beautiful with the atmosphere. All the snow-covered countrysides, the snow-covered station, and the snow-covered yards. It just really brings me back to my childhood, and I always look forward to watching this episode every Christmas. And that moment of Howard the helicopter bringing Father Christmas to the party is very whimsical. It just brings out your childlike imagination and the days where you reminisce about Father Christmas bringing you presents on Christmas Eve. It's just another one of those moments that dives right back into your childhood fantasy and your memories of Christmas from when you were kids. It's another thing that makes this episode all the more special around this time of year. I feel that Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree is definitely a satisfying conclusion to the second series. It brings all the characters minus Daisy together for a big Christmas party. It's a great Christmas story to wrap up on, and it's just so beautiful with the atmosphere and the camera work and the set pieces. It's one that will get you into the Christmas spirit every time around this time of year, so it's definitely worth a watch. And that was all 26 episodes of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends Series 2. It's been a real blast going through this series episode by episode. The second series is a series of the show that just gets better and better every time I rewatch it. And it's been a hell of a blast going through it again, seeing all the new characters, chases, races, runaways and crash scenes, and just the all-around wonderful stories that were adapted from the Railway series, as well as new rewritten stories from Christopher Audrey. It's just been one hell of a blast going through this series again this year for Thomascember, and I'm sure I'll continue to have a blast rewatching this particular series in the future. It's definitely one of the best that Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends has to offer. So until next year, I wish you guys a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. By popular demand, Project Tiger Moth, The Good Old Days. Ever since this was uploaded on the internet, a lot of fans have been asking me to review this one as well as Series 24, and having seen it myself, I thought it would be nice to review this as well, even though I have finished with Series 2 for this year. And for Series 24, I honestly didn't have that much time to rewatch every single episode this month, so you might see a full review of it next year after I do Series 3. But I definitely had all the time in the world at this point to review The Good Old Days Project Tiger Moth. This is a fan-made Gauge 1 project produced by Flying Pringle and various other users with accurate replica models of Thomas and his friends, making this the first Thomas project using Gauge 1 models in such a scale in nearly 15 years, since the model era of the show ended in 2008. In the video, Toby is upset that he didn't get to board passengers for days, but one day he brings a train of building supplies to Percy for the mainline extension. Things go wrong when the trucks push Toby down the hill, through some bushes and to an old manor station. Thomas and Percy both arrive and the Fat Controller praises Toby. After the restoration of his old tramline, the passengers board Henrietta and Toby is now happy that things are like the good old days again. This project was made to feel like we were back in Series 5 of the show, and it really does feel like a Series 5 episode to me, with the quality of the filming, the models, and the music as well. And you could tell that a lot of time and effort was put into this, since they wanted to make it feel like you were watching the classic TV series. And having rewatched it myself, the American dub and the official UK dub as well, this really does seem like what Thomas the Tank Engine could have been like if things hadn't gone downhill after Thomas and the Magic Railroad. This is what could have been if Britt Allcroft hadn't gotten fired from her position on the show. This project was also made as a dedication to the memory of David Mitton, the original director of the series. And you can really tell how much they admired his work with the camera work and the models and the sets. Every single bit of camera work in this episode is very reminiscent of how David Mitton would direct the series, positioning the cameras in such a way that seems very realistic and it's like you're right in front of the engines or right below the engines, as if you were filming them from your cameras and iPhones. And I think it's a very nice touch how they use stock footage of Toby and the Stout Gentleman for this episode in Toby's flashback. It's just one of those nice touches that brings us back to the classic series of the show when they would have flashbacks of old episodes. And even though I'm a UK fan myself, I do enjoy both American and UK narrations for this video. The UK one making it sound like a Liverpudlian narrated it like it used to be. And I love how the UK version gives the characters different voices and different accents, much like how Michelangelo's used to do. And the American dub is also really good as well. And even though most Thomas fans in America aren't a huge fan of his narrations, I do like how this guy sounds almost similar to Alec Baldwin, the guy who played Mr. Conductor in Thomas and the Magic Railroad and narrated the 5th and 6th series in America. I just find it a nice touch that they got someone who could do an impression of Alec. Project Tiger Moth has been referenced by many fans as the peak of the fandom's creativeness in fan projects, and an example of just how far the general public have come with them. And having watched it myself, it really does feel like an episode from the classic TV series. It just brought me back to those days when I would watch Series 5 in the late 90s. Just the excitement and the thrills of seeing these new episodes. And while this video doesn't really have a moral to it like most Thomas stories did back in the days, I don't think it really needed a moral. It was made as a pilot to show us what they could really do with their modelling skills. And they wanted to show as much love and care as David Mitton and Britt Allcroft did when they were in charge of the show. And it does just that. It brings us back to our childhoods in the late 90s when we were watching the classic series on VHS and TV, mainly the Series 5 era of the show. What else can I say about Project Tiger Moth, the good old days, other than it's a perfectly written, perfectly crafted and perfectly modelled and perfectly filmed love letter to our childhoods and the great work of the late great David Mitton. Check it out if you haven't already. It's definitely worth it.